Okay, buenos dias, good morning.
Good morning.
We're so happy you guys could be here with us. I know this is not the facility that you guys expected, but we, in good Miami fashion, always improvise. We're on Hispanic time, so everything's go, go, go. But welcome to Miami's embassy in the nation's capital. We're so glad to have you guys here with us. Welcome to FIU in DC. As you know, you're home away from home. I just wanted to give like a brief interview over what we do here in DC. We do essentially three things. You know, we help prepare the next generation of leaders and give them a taste of what it's like to be in the nation's capital. We also do what you're participating in. We have convenings and we bring together industry leaders, academia, to foster, you know, meaningful connections and network across the capital and with people all over the nation and internationally. And lastly, you know, we are advocates for policy and for our heritage, and we bring our Miami culture with us everywhere. So we're so glad you guys could be here today. My name is Isabella Ford. I'm new here at FIU in DC. I'm doing programming, so I helped put together this event today. So I really hope you guys enjoy. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, I want to introduce one of the directors for Inter-American Institute for Democracy, Mr. Norberto Esparga.
Thank you, Isabella. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I got to start thanking FIU and Carlos and Isabella for this last-minute arrangement. But they did, as usually we Latinos are very used to create things on the go every day. This is the Forum of Organized Crime and Democracy in Latin America, and it's done together with Infobae, the University of Austral of Argentina. We have Juan here representing them, the Institute, and the FIU. So welcome to this morning, which should be a very productive and very useful in all the discussions. I'm going to be moderating the first panel, and the structure of this panel will be fairly simple. Each of the individuals will have 5 minutes to make their points. We will start with Doc Farah, who will present for 10 minutes his study on a specifically case study. But before all that, we have an introduction by Carlos Giménez from the Congress. As you know, he should be here, but we all know what is going on in Washington, and therefore he has been kind enough to send us this digital welcome. We need the video. Part of the shutdown. Yeah, right. Do we have a video? Good. Did he send it electronically or is coming by Uber? We got it? Okay, it's coming. Okay, let me tell you, the Institute is an organization that has been devoted to promote democracy throughout the Americas. And we have these kind of forums almost every month to promote and inform a lot about what is going on in our Americas regarding democracy. But most importantly today, we're going to be focusing on organized crime and their effect on democracy. Not only on the crime itself, what it has to do with democracy in our countries in Latin America. They tell me I got to be talking. I didn't bring any stories. I should bring a story. Puede ser que lo haga todo en español ahora o en argentino. Este es un foro sobre el crimen organizado y la democracia en Latinoamérica, que está organizado con la Universidad Austral de Argentina, con FIU Miami, Infobae y el instituto. Creo que tenemos el video. ¿Podemos ir adelante? Yo creo que en los medios y en la televisión no nos va a ir muy bien a nosotros. Ok, voy a leer el programa. El programa entonces es este primer foro, va a ser 5 minutos de presentación cada uno y vamos a estar con la presentación que va a ser sobre su estudio de casos Douglas Farah. Y lo voy a presentar, Douglas, ya que estamos, te voy presentando y ganamos tiempo. y así vamos, no usamos el tiempo de ustedes después, que es tan importante. Douglas Farah is president of IBI Consultants, specializing in field research, security challenges, and transnational organized crime in Latin America. From 2013 to 2022, Farah was a visiting senior researcher at National Defense University. For the 2 decades before founding IBI Consultants in 2005, Farah worked as a foreign correspondent and investigative reporter for the Washington Post, covering civil wars in Central America and organized crime in South America. I think we had a video.
And so while I don't have a to-do list for the U.S. government, I do have a... Good morning. My name is Carlos Giménez. I'm a congressman representing Florida's 28th Congressional District. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today. Obviously, you know that the government, U.S. government is closed, and so while I don't have a to-do list for the U.S. government, I do have a to-do list from my wife. So here I am at home working at my house. Again, I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there, and but it's my pleasure to give you this short video to the Forum on Organized Crime and Democracy in Latin America. Organized crime is the greatest threat to democracy in Latin America. Today we have a drug lord that's actually in charge of the entire country, Venezuela. The good thing is that the Trump administration is doing something about it. For the first time, we've actually declared war on organized crime, these terrorists, these narco-terrorists that have killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. This is something that I've been asking for a number of years. Why we hadn't designated the drug cartels in Colombia, Venezuela, and Mexico as terrorist organization was beyond me, because they have killed far more Americans than Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization. And so I'm very glad of the actions that the president is taking, very aggressive stance against these narco traffickers, these terrorists that have been killing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans for a number of years now. And so I wish you, good luck on your forum. Again, sorry I couldn't be there, but know that you have my 100% support. Thank you. God bless you all.
Well, thank you. Well, we are now ready to go. I think I already made the introductions to Douglas. I mean, everybody knows him also, and I'm going to give you the 10 minutes to present. By the way, the book, a summary and a new book, just a new release of, especially for this forum, is available here. You can take it with you home. Douglas?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you to FIU and all the sponsors here, the Institute and others, the opportunity to be here. Is there a way to see the time, or can you, when I get to 2 minutes, let me know, and I'll do it. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we framed this particular project and where it comes from and how we came to this. I recently wrote another publication for Florida International University, which I called The Fourth Wave of Transnational Organized Crime in Latin America. And basically my thesis in that paper was that we're undergoing a transformative moment in transnational crime in Latin America that unlike we've ever seen before. We're at an entirely new world in terms of transnational organized crime actors, etc. Essentially, I defined the first wave as Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel and their ability to create massive amounts of cocaine, move it to the United States, and bring the money back to Colombia. And the assault on the state of Colombia as an act of war against the Colombian state. Pablo Escobar gets killed. With Pacho, I lived through those moments together in Colombia for many years, President Pastrana. And after that moment passes, you have what we define the second wave is the Cali cartel. They are much more innovative. They move the trafficking routes from the Caribbean to Mexico, which gives birth to the Mexican cartels you see today. And they're much more sophisticated, but you still have essentially one product, which is cocaine, going to one market, which is the United States, and the money coming back to the countries of origin. The third wave we defined as the Bolivarian Revolution, where for the first time you have states, Venezuela, at the time Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, embracing a criminal structure as an instrument of state policy, which was at that moment the FARC. There was the ability and the courting of FARC, the use of their money, their incorporating of the FARC into their government structure as instruments of state policy, as opposed to what we had seen before, which was corruption, right? You wanted to buy a judge so you could go free. You wanted to buy an aduana agent so you could get your drug across the border. You wanted to buy a policeman to turn a blind eye. This, for the first time with the Bolivarians, you saw the incorporation of a criminal group into the financial flows and the protection both of the Venezuelan state, because they're operating on the Colombia border with Venezuela, and into taking policy decisions on their behalf and bringing in weapons for them. But again, still we had essentially the same model. You had one product primarily. It grew into two with the expansion into illicit gold, of cocaine going to one market basically, which was the United States. Gold started to flow in significant ways after a decade of the Bolivarians. You have the defeat of Rafael Correa in Bolivia and Ecuador. You have the defeat eventually of Evo Morales in Bolivia. Daniel Ortega remains firmly ensconced, as does the Maduro regime. So what's different about the fourth wave that leads us to this study? This is for the first time we have seen a whole host of new products, which is why territories that we discussed in this study on the subregions of Argentina that are still feudal are so important. You have a massive increase in illicit markets, and you have a massive increase in actors in the region. So for the first time in Latin America, we have established on the ground functioning entities. The 'Ndrangheta, the Italian mafia, we have the Albanian mafias, we have the Turkish mafias, we have the Russian mafias, we have the Chinese mafias, we have a whole series of new actors, and part of this is due to, and again, it's one of the driving factors which I'll talk about on the sub-state level in Argentina. You have an enormous change in the global drug market. The United States consumption of cocaine is stable or dropping, and the prices are relatively stable. We are no longer the most attractive market for cocaine in the world. We're very attractive for synthetics and other things, but not for cocaine. Where have prices skyrocketed? Europe, the former Soviet Republic, as well as Australia and New Zealand. So if you can sell a kilo for $17,000 in Miami, maybe $20,000 in New York, or $35,000 in Spain, where are you going to start looking for? Because we're talking about rational economic actors, and when we talk about transnational organized crime, they're primarily motivated by rational economic decisions. So how does this impact what we're seeing now? Ports become tremendously important in ways that they weren't before, because you can't fly a ton of cocaine to Europe. You can't put it on a human mula and send it across the border. You have to begin using containers to move things across large spaces and times to markets that are very available. At the same time, as we've seen, and President Mahuad clearly knows, in Ecuador we had an unusual phenomenon which gave rise to what we're seeing today, which was President Correa's decision to declare universal citizenship, ciudadanía universal, which essentially allowed anyone to move into Ecuador without any background checks in any way. And then that's where you see the beginnings of the incursions of the Albanian mafias and the other mafias. They came in starting in 2010, set up, many of them changed their identities from their original Balkan identity to another Balkan identity, then eventually to Ecuadorian identity. So now we have no idea who these people really are, because their real identities have been lost in the midst of time. But when you see Ecuador explode into this level of violence with the Albanians, it's not something that came out of nowhere. It's something that had been there, gestating for many years, and then the conditions were correct. So we have this explosion of violence. So as we were looking at all of that, we were looking at other factors too, because you have these, that's on the national state level, where you're seeing, you can identify these trends. And then we're seeing places, as we did the study in Argentina with the support of the Institute and FIU and others, to identify the sub-state actors that are making all of this possible too, because you have across the region existing systems of caudillismo, where you still have, in many cases, the remnants of the old regimes of strongmen who have lasted for decades. So in the case of Santiago del Estero, you have a governor and his wife who have been there since 2004 and have not given up power since. They alternate between being One is the senator, a senator, usually the wife, and the governor stays, and they rotate amongst themselves. But 20 years in power without any change. Other provinces that are basically the same. And it really took root under the government of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, the Kirchner couple, when they took power, where they began to use these isolated feudal states, which eventually, as we were able to document and spend a lot of time on the ground in Santiago del Estero and elsewhere in Argentina, where the governor has his own police force, his own intelligence service, control of the courts, he has control of the internet, he has control of all the media. And so you have, in a relatively democratic nation like Argentina, these enclaves of departmental power where the feudal structure still exists. And those are important because, for example, Santiago del Estero is right in the middle of the lithium. It doesn't have lithium itself, but it's right in the middle of the lithium belt. It's also on the key highway transit of cocaine that goes from Bolivia, to the coast, because now you need the ports. You need to get to Montevideo, you need to get to Buenos Aires to move your product to market. At the same time, you have this ongoing parallel phenomenon of internal consumption in Latin America of cocaine. So for years, people would always say, and they were generally right, it's a U.S. problem, right? The consumption is there, we produce it, it's a U.S. problem. That's no longer the case. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay are among the top 10 per capita consumers of cocaine now in the world. And so you have this dynamic also moving the cocaine markets. So in this general framework, these feudal provincial governments that operate completely autonomously from the state, and that's not true. They don't operate completely autonomously. They take decisions autonomously from the state, and in exchange for massive central government subsidies, they give the votes, they make sure that their voters vote for the government in power. Primarily in this case, the Cristina, La Cámpora, the groups around the Kirchners, because it solidified their power in the central government in exchange for complete autonomy in the regional states. So as we were looking at these groups, we found commonalities that define, I would say, authoritarian states at the national level are all implemented at the subnational level in ways that have created enormous disaster zones inside these countries. Because, for example, Santiago del Estero and the other states, provinces we looked at, are among the poorest in Argentina. They get the most subsidy per capita from the federal government, and it's all essentially siphoned off by the local government. So the people get nothing. They have the highest rates of extreme poverty, the highest rates of illiteracy, the highest rates of being without basic domestic services like sewage, et cetera, while on the surface while the money is flowing in, it's not getting anywhere near them. And so you have these extraordinary circumstances, and I keep talking about Santiago del Estero because it was the most dramatic, where you have a governor who built a world-class soccer stadium, literally like Macarena in Brazil, and there's almost no soccer matches there. It was a pure giant money laundering effort. It's a beautiful stadium, big statue, gold-plated Maradona in front of it, now sort of fading because they haven't kept it up. But it's just, you have to see it to actually understand the magnitude of what you're seeing. They have a whole series of other projects where they talk about how they've done like electric trains. But if you ride their trams, they're all diesel generated. There's nothing electric about them. They put in an international airport that gets 2 international flights a month. Okay, that's interesting. And they have all of the trappings of this. But so you essentially have mechanisms at the local level that allow massive laundering and the protection of the drug flows that are now flowing primarily from Bolivia, Peru, south to Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and now we're seeing it leak into Chile and onto the Pacific coast and doing other things. But these groups become incredibly important, these states, because the national state has very little say there. And I'll finish by saying one of the remarkable things that Argentinians know, but I didn't know when we started looking at this, is that the provincial government controls the land and everything under the land. So if you are a lithium company, as we saw with the Chinese in multiple states in Argentina, that province can negotiate directly with the Chinese. It doesn't pass through the central government at all. So you have, for example, as we were looking at the anomalies, because one of the things I learned working as a journalist and then with the U.S. government, is that if you want to understand how money moves, look for the anomalies. What does not make rational economic sense? And that's where you're going to begin to discover this. So supposedly in Santiago del Estero, they're building one of the largest lithium factories in the world, which means you have to extract the lithium. They have no direct route to the sea. The train hasn't run in like the last 20 years. It takes 48 hours by truck to get there. Then you have to send it to be refined in China. Then it has to come back, and you have to put it back up in Santiago instead and start building batteries. Not an economically rational model. So what does that tell you about what's actually going on there? You probably have a giant bunch of people, the governor paid off by an enormous amounts of money to create the semblance of, to let the Chinese do whatever they want to do. In the lithium provinces surrounding Santiago del Estero, what we found consistently was that the Chinese companies, primarily Chinese and some Canadian companies, but the Chinese were much more aggressive, would come in and say, okay, we need this piece of land for lithium. And if there is an indigenous population, they would say to the police, can you remove them? And they say, sure. Boom, off you go. No reports of human rights abuse. Well, the Institute has documented human rights abuses and other things, but largely in the international community, that's all, because it's far away, nobody really pays attention to it, it's hard to get to, etc. That whole structure remains with an enormous amount of impunity. So what we were trying to document in this particular in the study was the importance of not just looking at the national structures, because those we can identify and they're on our radar at least. If we're not very effective in combating them, we at least know where they are. The subnational ones, and we did Argentina, but the same type of structure exists in Brazil, exists in to a degree in northern Chile. Peru has these type of islands. Every country has these very, very isolated and very powerful caudillos that still exist and bring about an enormous amount of resources to the central government, foment corruption, and are huge supports in the substructure of transnational organized crime. So I will leave it there. I don't know what the next forum is, but I will leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Doug. Now I'll introduce Carlos Gervasoni. He is a research professor and a chair of the Department of Political Science and International Studies of the Universidad Torcuato Di Tella of Argentina. He holds a master's degree in political science from Stanford University and a PhD in political science from the University of Notre Dame. He's the author of Hybrid Regimes Within Democracies, Fiscal Federalism, and Subnational Rentier States from Cambridge University. He's also the regional manager for Latin America of the Varieties of Democratic Project. Carlos Gervasoni, thank you.
Thank you very much, Norberto. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with so many good colleagues from academia, statesmen, policymakers, and I would like to thank the organizers, the International Institute for Democracy, Florida International University, Universidad Austral, and Infobae for inviting me. I would like to provide some political context to the presentation that Doug just did. I specialize in provincial politics in Argentina, and I want to say, many of you may be familiar with Argentina, some of you may not, that Argentina is a federal democracy like the United States with very strong and autonomous provinces. They are very powerful. As Doug was hinting, these governors can do a lot of things without national approval. Even though they are very similar institutionally, when you see politics, in fact, in each province, they vary a lot, especially in terms of democracy and authoritarianism. Several Argentine provinces, maybe the ones you may be more familiar with, like Córdoba, Santa Fe, the province of Buenos Aires, Mendoza, are quite democratic. They are well-functioning democracies, while some other provinces have very clear authoritarian features. They are institutionally democratic, they have elections, they have opposition parties, but when you see politics on the ground, practices are quite authoritarian. In democratic provinces such as the ones I mentioned, there are elections, parties lose and win elections. Nobody has large majorities in the legislature. People feel free to express their opinions. There is a free press and a quite pluralistic press. While at the other end of the spectrum, you have provinces that different scholars call hegemonic and democratic, or hybrid. You heard the title of my book, hybrid regimes, in the sense that they have some democratic features, but they are mostly authoritarian. And the typical feature of these provinces is that governors never lose elections, ever. We have had 42 years of democracy, and that's something that doesn't happen in any real democracies around the world. Not only they never lose elections, but they win with suspicious majorities of 60, 70% in a row in some of the poorest provinces of Argentina, where you don't see policy actually working, right? So by winning large majorities and bending the rules to make those majorities turn into even larger majorities in the legislature, they end up electing their own judges, and after a few years, the political system is completely dominated by a party, typically the Peronist party, not everywhere, and sometimes even by a person or a family. The local media tends to be completely biased in favor of the incumbents, and people are, afraid of criticizing the government. There are informal ways of punishing dissidents. And there is typically there is spying on opponents, spying on journalists, on judges, on politicians in the opposition. Since Argentina democratized in 1983, the provinces that have most clearly fit this model of less democratic provinces I'm mentioning are Catamarca, Formosa, San Luis, La Rioja, Santa Cruz, which is, by the way, the home of the Kirchners, where Kirchner started his political career as governor there, and Santiago del Estero. You may be less familiar with these provinces. They tend to be smaller in population. Sometimes they're poorer, not always. They are heavily subsidized by the tax-sharing rules of Argentina's fiscal federalism. And the ones that Doug emphasized tend to be in the north of the country that has all of these other complexities related to the traffic of drugs across borders. These provinces are completely dominated by governors. The checks and balances that are formally in place are completely ineffective. Judges and the legislatures rubber stamp whatever the governor wants to decide. And maybe the most iconic figure of this sort of governance in Argentina is Governor Gildo Insfrán, who has been in this position for 30 years, getting 8 consecutive re-elections. Before that, he was 8 years vice governor. So this is a person, and he will die in his position, I'm sure, and probably will leave a relative to succeed him. Gerardo Zamora of Santiago del Estero also amended the provincial constitution to allow for unlimited re-election, but the National Supreme Court, and this is very important, recently ruled against this rule, saying that it was unrepublican to have unlimited re-elections for governors. So what he did was appointing his wife as the person to succeed him, and after one term sitting out, he came back. Doug mentioned that when they are not governors, Zamora and his wife are in the Senate. And I'm going to add something very important to this. Both of them were appointed by the Peronists, by Cristina Kirchner first, and then again by Cristina Kirchner as vice president in the last Fernandez administration, as the presidents of the Senate. And that means that they are the second people in the succession line for the president. After the president and the vice president, Gerardo Zamora and his wife were for 6 years number 3 in the presidential succession line in Argentina. I have only less than a minute, so I'm going to say something very important, is that what is behind this variance that I mentioned between Mendoza and Santiago del Estero is fiscal federalism. Doug hinted at this. We have a way of distributing money that provides a lot of money to these small, poor provinces in Argentina, Governors are very rich. They don't tax basically their population. And this is, of course, as you can imagine, a very favorable political situation. Everybody depends on the government budget in these provinces. You know, public employees, most people are public employees, the media, businesses in the province, you know, NGOs, everybody depends on a government paycheck. And therefore, building an opposition is impossible. Nobody wants to be in bad terms with the provincial governor. So I'm going to close, because now I'm maybe over my time limit, to go back to the decision of the Supreme Court that I mentioned. That is, I see, if you had to think about how to solve this problem, one, of course, would be to change the legislation regarding fiscal federalism. And these rulings of the Supreme Court that have affected Formosa, Santiago del Estero, and several other provinces in Argentina, I think are a very good development, because basically it means first that we're paying attention to this issue. This issue was completely under the radar until recently. And second, that some of the most outrageous practices of these provinces are being turned down by the national government. You know, the Supreme Court, after all, is a branch of the national government. I'm just going to say that, finishing by saying that, of course, Argentina, as Doug mentioned, has been a resilient democracy since 1983. We have had a lot of problems, but democracy has basically held up. But we still have these enclaves of very undemocratic governance in Argentina. And of course, those places are very favorable for all sorts of illegal activities, from, you know, narco traffic to corruption. And you do see, it's difficult to find out actual evidence of this, but you do see that a lot of the very corrupt practices that characterize Argentina are conducted at subnational level in provinces like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm going to introduce now Juan Zárate, who is the global managing partner of the consulting firm K2 Integrity. Mr. Zárate served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism from 2005 to 2009, the nation's fifth counterterrorism czar. He was also the first ever Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury for Terrorist Financing, where he led the creation of the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. He served in numerous boards and committees, including twice being appointed by the Pope to serve on the board of the Vatican Financial Information Authority. He's also a widely published author. He has a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard College, a cum laude graduate for the Harvard Law School. Juan, welcome.
Norberto, gracias. Buenos días. Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here, Norberto. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's really an honor for me to be part of this esteemed panel, especially my good and long-standing friend Doug Farah, who's done some of the best work in this field, looking at the nexus of organized crime and illicit finance of anybody that I've known. So it's really an honor to be here. I want to thank FIU for hosting us on short notice, and I want to thank all the sponsors, including the Institute. In my 5 minutes, I want to talk a bit about the centrality of organized crime as a threat to democracy and a threat to the integrity of the financial system. The extreme forms of violence, the infiltration of economies, the corruption of systems, and even the capture of institutions is a fundamental threat to Latin America as well as globally. I was privileged, starting early in my career, I was a prosecutor, a counterterrorism prosecutor. One of the first cases I worked on was on the murder of 3 American citizens by the FARC, who were murdered in Colombia and then taken over the border into Venezuela. At the Treasury Department, I was privileged to lead the effort in the creation of the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, where we used sanctions policy and anti-money laundering controls to make it harder, costlier, and riskier for what we said America's enemies to raise and move money around the world. And more that included not just state actors, but non-state actors and criminal actors. And then at the White House, we saw the growing convergence that Doug talked about between state and non-state actors to not only threaten democracy, but also to profit and to corrupt institutions and sectors. I think it's why, in part, the Cuban government called me Bush's mercenary, which I take as a badge of honor. But I want to build off of what Doug said, and his description of the waves of criminality are very interesting because of the academic treatment of the waves of democracy. My first book is called Forging Democracy, very much took from the work of Samuel Huntington and others talking about the 3 waves of democracy. I really like Doug's framing of 4 waves of illicit activity and the contrarians to democracy. The way I like to think of that 4th wave is of a convergence of 3 key factors. The first is a convergence of activities among criminal actors. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms trafficking, matched now with illegal mining, and also then the co-optation of rare earth mineral production, all in furtherance of profit for illicit actors. That then blended with extortion and infiltration of sectors of economies that are controlled by criminal actors, where ownership and control is mixed between licit and illicit activities. Then you have the profits and proceeds that are used to form a cycle of corruption that then allows further and further empowerment, a vicious cycle of empowerment of these groups. And so the activities are blended and converged. You have a convergence of actors. You have an admixture of criminal organizations, cartels, gangs, as well as terrorist groups. My experience with Hezbollah was watching Hezbollah take full advantage of the European drug trade, moving product from South America, laundering those proceeds through the United States and Canada, using used car dealers and the shipment of cars into West Africa to then move goods into Europe and also proceeds into Lebanon. And so a very clear admixture of criminality, illicit finance, and terrorism, which, by the way, explains then why there's such a challenge with how to define these groups. Are they criminals? Are they terrorists? Are they state proxies? Are they militant groups? In some cases, they're all of the above, right? The admixture of these groups. Made worse by the fact that now Venezuela and Nicaragua, as Doug described very aptly, use these groups as state proxies, instruments of state activity for profit and also for political control. You also then have supply chains that are evolving, whether it's in the lithium context, as the professor mentioned, with China in the Southern Cone, or the fentanyl trade with Chinese precursor providers fueling the activity of Mexican cartels, which is then fueling activity into the United States, which has drawn so much attention, certainly to the corruption of the Mexican financial system as a result. So you have this admixture of actors happening in this 4th wave, as Doug has described. And then finally, a challenge and an admixture of governance, where in pockets around the world, you have criminal actors actually in control of territory, control of institutions, and co-opting and embedding within those territories and activities. And that, of course, then has implications for civil society, because that control then means co-optation of the judiciary, the media, NGOs, the co-optation of all the civil actors, and the fueling of fear that doesn't allow for independent voices to check the growth of those actors. All of this is fueled by profit, rational economic actors finding opportunity, but it's enabled by opacity, impunity, and immorality. The opacity of lack of transparency, who owns and controls companies, accounts, corruption of officials, who are they really acting on behalf of, embedding in sectors of the economy in ways that are not clearly understood. Impunity with a lack of accountability for the violence against institutions and actors, prosecutors, politicians that are speaking out against these actors, a fear to hold powerful people and institutions to account, and in the worst and most extreme cases of impunity, an open brazenness to the criminality and the corruption, because there is so much control of the economy and of the political institutions. And finally, immorality, the extreme violence used to silence voices, the 32 Mexican candidates killed in the run-up to the June 2024 election, the killing of the presidential candidate in Ecuador in 2023, of course, as an extreme example. Extreme violence meant to cow voices and civil society. Extortion and fraud and illicit finance that impoverishes people and families, that undermines the ability of people to make a living and undermines the ability of people to aspire. And of course, the long-term effects of corruption and kleptocracy that hollows out economies for short-term gain with prejudice to long-term effects. So that's all very negative and very problematic, but I come from the world of what do you do next? What is to be done? You have to have a strategy to attack all elements of their power, including illicit finance. You have to expose what they're doing. Doug's work is case in point. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Supporting independent media voices, using new technology to expose what's really happening. Having accountability, not just criminal accountability, but also in the markets with banks, investors, all having power from the outside to draw accountability on the inside. And having a new strategy of how we network and support each other. This conference is a good example, Norberto. I think the bad guys collude, the state authoritarians work with the anti-democratic forces, working with the criminal forces. We too need to think more aggressively about networking among the democratic allies. FIUs, financial intelligence units, sharing more information. Banks working more proactively and investors working more proactively to demand anti-corrupt environments and silos. Prosecutors collaborating across borders, supporting each other. Civil society, NGOs supporting as well. All with the use of new technologies, many of which are intended to democratize the sharing of information or financial autonomy. These need to be used and enabled for the forces of democratic good. And so with that, I think we should leave on an optimistic note. There's a lot to be done in the face of a lot of corruption and a lot of collaboration among the enemies of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. That was a good introduction for the next speaker, because there are some good stories also, some success in doing what Juan just mentioned. So I'm going to introduce Juliana Velázquez Rodriguez, who is the Secretary President of Pro Antioquia, assuming her role in July of 2025. A lawyer by training from the University de los Andes, she holds a title in international law from the Instituto de Empresa in Madrid and brings over 2 decades of leadership experience in transformation, innovation, and institutional strengthening. Juliana, welcome.
I'm glad I'm in charge of the positive note. Good morning to everybody. Thank you at the Institute for the invitation. Good morning, Mr. President Pastrana, Mr. Vice President Francisco Santo. I'm deeply honored to represent the voice of thousands of Colombian citizens and business leaders who have witnessed and helped shape one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of Latin America. Let me begin with a single word: yes. Yes, in 1991, Medellin was the most violent city in the world, with more than 400 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Yes, terror ruled our streets, car bombs, assassinations, and fear became part of daily life, taking the lives of brave police officers, social leaders, and innocent citizens. Yes, in the 1980s and the 1990s, illegal armed groups expanded across Colombia, reaching nearly 40,000 criminals, spreading violence through our countryside, and cities alike. And yet, Medellin refused to die. While the world only saw chaos, a group of brave business and civic leaders, educators, public officials, and visionary mayors embraced the conviction that there can be no successful companies in failed societies. They chose to stay, to rebuild, and to defend hope. At Pro Antioquia, the organization that I lead, founded in 1975, we became a platform of trust, a bridge between the private and public sectors committed to building public value. Even in the darkest years, we led efforts to dream and to act, supporting the creation of the Medellin subway, advocating for an international airport, driving education and social agendas, and convening the difficult yet essential conversations our city needed to survive. We believed, and still believe, that what is public belongs to all of us, and only working together can we build a future worth inheriting. Today, Medellin stands transformed. We turn pain into resilience, despair into innovation. More than 1.3 million visitors come each year to witness this rebirth, a city once defined by tragedy, now known for technology, culture, and creativity. But let us not be deceived. Transformation is never final. Our resilience is tested every single day, especially today. In recent years, Medellin has faced new forms of corruption, populism, and institutional erosion. We watch as public programs that shaped our children's future, such as Buen Comienzo, were dismantled. We endured open hostility toward the business community, threatening the trust that took decades to build. Our former mayor, Daniel Quintero, today facing criminal and administrative proceedings while seeking the presidency, symbolizes the fragility of democratic governance when institutions are weakened and impunity grows. But the threat extends far beyond one man. Colombian democracy itself is at risk. As the United States desertifies Colombia in its anti-narcotics efforts and the so-called total peace policy empowers illegal armed groups, the private sector in Medellin and Antioquia has decided to take a stand, to support regional governors who resist and to protect institutions that defend democracy. We refuse to surrender to cynicism or chaos. We choose to focus on the future, and that is why I'm here standing before you today. Our conviction is simply yet profound. Take care of the present to safeguard the future. Through Pro Antioquia, we are leading projects that transform regions and renew hope. The airport region, connecting Medellin to global markets, sustainable tourism strategies celebrating culture while protecting nature, the transformation of Urabá on Colombian northern coast into the nation's next agro-industrial and port hub. These are not just development initiatives, these are acts of resistance against despair, because we know that the future will only flourish if institutions remain strong, the rule of law is protected, and citizens reclaim trust in democracy. The story of Medellin teaches us that transformation is possible, but only through collective courage and unwavering collaboration. We cannot let fatigue or fear erode what we have built. Our fight is not against a city's past, but for a nation's future. So allow me to end as I began, with yes. Yes, we face the growing threat of transnational organized crime. Yes, populist leaders across the region challenge the foundation of democracy. But also yes, in Medellin, in Antioquia, and in Colombia, citizens, business leaders, and entrepreneurs are standing together to defend freedom, rebuild trust, and shape a future of dignity and hope. As we stand here in Washington, we reaffirm that from the private sector of Medellin and of Colombia, we are convinced of the need for a joint and determined policy between our nations to confront and eradicate transnational organized crime, the greatest current threat to democracy and stability in a region. Today, just in 1980, our decision is not to flee from Colombia, but to stay, to work hand in hand with the public sector, to prove once again that resilience can be a model for the world. Because Medellin is not a city that surrendered. It's a city that transformed pain into purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a lot of hope in your talk. Thank you. Gracias, muchísimas gracias. I'm going to introduce now Beatrice Rangel. She is an international with masters in economic development from Boston University and Harvard Public Administration. Since '94, she has developed her career in the area of operation and consulting. He's the managing director of AMLA Consulting, a company created in 2004 that specializes in advising companies and leaders of the private and public sector in defining strategies to reach higher levels of personal and corporate development. In her country of origin, Venezuela, she was a deputy for the Miranda State, Secretary General of the Ministry of Education, Minister of the Secretariat of the President, and director of many other activities, and she's also one of our best directors. Beatrice, welcome.
Thank you, Norberto, for your very kind presentation. I'm thankful also to the Inter-American Institute for Democracy and its executive director, Carlos Sanchez Berzain, for inviting me to share with you the results of research conducted at the Institute in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. The research examines the makings of narco-states in Latin America, reaching the conclusion that while Colombia and Mexico are the greatest producers of drugs in our hemisphere, neither can be considered a narco-state, as authorities are not part of the criminal establishment that produces drugs. Neither is their economy dependent on the income flows arising from drug production and trafficking. In the case of Venezuela, which is what they asked me to develop today, it's very different, because there you have state authorities conducting drug trafficking operations and a political establishment that facilitates these operations. The country's economy, while relying on oil and to a minor degree on the exploitation of gold and other natural resources, is conducted through illicit procedures that feed back on the traffic of narcotics, people, and forged items. Understanding the operational model is key to defining what needs to be done to confront what to my mind is the most challenging threat to democracy and economic growth in the region. The building blocks of the Venezuelan model are three. First, the people's discontent with democracy. Second, the rent-seeking economic elites. And then fragile institutions. Let's tackle one by one. The people's discontent with democracy sprang from the exhaustion of the rent-structuring model, which has financed democratic behavior since 1959. To be sure, GDP in Venezuela expanded from 7.9 billion in 1960 to 59.1 billion in 1980. But thereafter, GDP began to drop until it reached what I call the People's Rebellion level of 48.6 billion by 1990. The second, which is the rent-structured nature of the economic elites, led to economic stagnation and poverty. The proportion of Venezuelans living in poverty by 1960 was 6%. But by 1998, it was 16%. So it was growing, not shrinking. Rent-seeking behavior secures closed markets, impending competition, innovation, and entrepreneurship. People living in poverty then drew the conclusion that the established system was unable to provide the means for them to escape poverty. Many turned then to illicit trades to secure a better living for their families. Detailed drug trafficking became one of the ways out of poverty. Then the third factor, which is fragile institutions, facilitated the political corruption that oiled the wheels of democracy. Businessmen could exact monopolistic prices because they pay politicians to keep tariffs high enough to seal out any competition. The military charged between 5 and 10% over all their procurements. Political parties received generous contributions from businessmen interested in keeping the tariffs high. Public works were too frequently allocated to companies that knew little about the project at hand, but a lot about how to get politicians to obtain projects for them. And all this was played in plain eyesight to an enraged middle class and a desperate low-income families. By the time a correction course was attempted by the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1989, it was too late. Venezuelans were sold to radical change. Hugo Chávez Frías incarnated that radical change. He had tried a coup d'etat, had taken responsibility for the event, and was seen by most of the population to be the person who could do away with the corrupt elites that controlled the country. But Mr. Chávez had other items in his agenda. He saw himself as the vindicator of the poor and the person who could look at the United States in the eye. Being a military officer, he was familiar with national security threats analysis and identified the drug trade as a leverage to impact the United States policies to Venezuela. Accordingly, and to statements made by his chief military intelligence officer, who's now in prison here in the United States, drugs were the means to both weaken the U.S. social fabric as well as to provide his movement with financial resources to expand regionally while buying loyalties at home. And this was said by Hugo Chávez himself to this gentleman who is now in prison here in the United States. Also, according to this same source, he instructed the military to cease drug trafficking from the usual handlers, that is, the drug lords from Colombia and Mexico, and his regime took over the drug business from the cartels to carry out under the surveillance of Mr. Padrino and Mr. Cabello. So part one of the Venezuela tragedy was built right there. In 2001, the failed military civic society reaction against Mr. Chávez, clear turn towards autocracy, pushed Mr. Chávez further into criminal direction. He realized that to secure unending power, he needed to have an army of his own. Two means were used. First, government called upon supporters to register in a militia. Second, the government closed defense pacts with petty organized crime. The gangs assailing low-income neighborhoods became the government's eyes and ears and the whipping tool. And finally, an alliance was closed with the radical and violent guerrilla groups from Colombia whose drug trafficking practices were documented. And to top this ice cream with a cherry, Fidel Castro became the chief strategic officer of the regime. A perfect criminal organization was thus created to secure control of Venezuela, while at the same time to open new avenues of revenue for the regime. With time, the regime in Venezuela saw the opportunity to protect itself from unfriendly governments in the hemisphere by triggering an astounding migration of about 8 million people, or 20% of the population. Hidden among those migrants were some gang leaders directly sent by the government with the mission to exact revenge upon enemies of the regime in the hemisphere. Proof of the pudding is Chile, where one person, a Venezuelan military officer who was on the refuge from the government of Chile was killed. This is of course a very sketchy picture of the Venezuelan regime, but it leads us to believe that the whole hemisphere is facing one of the most dangerous threats in history. As in Venezuela, there is a regime run by criminal intents that has created its own resources to support both economically and militarily, and has metastasized over nations in the region such as Bolivia and Nicaragua, and is working hard to bring Colombia into its realm. It is our assessment that since the times of Port Royal, our hemisphere has not been threatened by transnational organized crime as it is now by the presence of a criminal regime in Venezuela with power to contaminate many other nations. Of course, this needs to address the root causes of the problem. If these three root causes of the problem are not addressed, which is fragile institutions, rent-seeking economic elites, and this terrible corruption, then what we will have in Venezuela, even if there is a change of regime, is business as usual for the criminal networks. Because just think about Mexico. Has drug trafficking disappeared with 52 of their capos in prison here in the United States? It has not. So we need to address the root causes. Thank you.
He's taking my papers. Thank you, Beatrice. I'm going to introduce now Dr. Eduardo Gamarra. He obtained his doctorate in political science at the University of Pittsburgh in 1987. He has been affiliated with FIU since 1986, where he currently serves as a full professor of the Department of Political and International Relations. He is the author of numerous articles and books on democracy and politics in America, and his work has been widely recognized both in the academic field and the field of public policies. Eduardo, welcome.
Professors tend to be long-winded, so and I know the rigidness of the timekeeper, so I've prepared some remarks based on a paper that I just wrote on Bolivia that I printed 10 copies, and you'll be able to get them, and it's also on our website at the Jack Gordon Institute. I want to especially thank the Institute for hosting this. I want to give our welcome also to our colleagues from our Argentine partner university, Universidad Austral, and of course Infobae, and I'm especially pleased that we were able to lure you here after the government shutdown. I also want to welcome such a distinguished panel here of former heads of state, former secretary generals, and so on. And so thank you very much. And I'm also delighted to be able to follow such a distinguished panel, especially somebody who I went to school with in Bolivia many, many years ago, Doug Farah. So let me start out by sort of combining the good news, bad news story here. And my talk is called Territories of Coca and Cocaine, okay? Bolivia at a Crossroads. I think Bolivia stands at a crossroads today, at a historic crossroads. On October 19th, Bolivians will choose between Jorge Tuto Quiroga and Rodrigo Paz. On November 8th, a new president will take office. That's sort of the good news. For 2 decades, Bolivia has been governed as what I now term a narco-competitive authoritarian regime, a system where elections were held and formal democratic institutions remained in place. Incumbents, however, manipulated the playing field through repression, through judicial interference, and through systemic harassment of opponents, while the cocaine economy infiltrated unions, regions, and government institutions. In that sense, and I think this is probably a very understudied phenomenon, Bolivia has become a hub for the global cocaine trade. This hybrid regime, following Gervasoni's kind of notion of hybrid regimes, blurred the line between the state and the criminal enterprise. Political control was maintained through cocalero unions, through state institutions that were weakened, and the cocaine trade, which financed local power while linking Bolivia to trafficking organizations, as Doug Farah's work has demonstrated, from Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, Italy, the Balkans, Turkey, Russia, and others, which we have yet to identify. Now, the good news, in a sense, is that today the system is unraveling politically, and the authoritarian structure is ending, even though just listening to the radio this morning, it looks like there's still some, few pataleos by the mass and trying to postpone the inevitable result. So while the system is unraveling politically and the authoritarian structure is ending, the narcotics infrastructure remains fully operational. And to me, that is the gravest challenge. And that is why Bolivia faces a very unique moment. Bolivia is indeed witnessing the end of authoritarianism, but it is not witnessing the end of narco-trafficking power. And that's what makes it challenging. So whoever inherits Bolivia on November the 8th inherits both the opportunity and the obligation to confront this legacy. So let me just very, very quickly, in the minutes that I have left, note the 4 zones of challenge that really comprise this hub that I've been talking about. These 4 regions that together are really the spine of the illicit economy in Bolivia, and the hub, the central South American hub for cocaine. First is the Chapare, which all of you are familiar with, which is the production engine. Once kind of a symbol of indigenous empowerment even, it is now the epicenter of illicit coca leaf production and the refinement of cocaine. Okay? Unions that once defended farmers now protect an economy where most coca, 90% in fact, becomes cocaine. Chemists run mega labs with near impunity. Second is the Yungas, the cultural heart of the coca, and also the place where my family comes from. Here the issue is political manipulation, imposed leaders, parallel markets, and the loss of trust between growers and the state. Restoring confidence and legitimacy there will require transparency and genuine dialogue. I'm not advocating the complete eradication of coca, primarily because of the cultural tradition. Third, Santa Cruz, the cocaine production, logistics, and laundering hub of Bolivia. Our economic capital today has become a safe haven for the PCC, the Comando Vermelho, the CJNG, Ndrangheta, Balkan groups, etc. These groups move drugs, launder money, and infiltrate business networks. Combating this will demand clean institutions and strong financial intelligence, that other FIU you're talking about. Fourth, and this is probably a relatively new discovery, and I think my paper has gone in great depth into the Altiplano corridor, Chayapata, that area called Mexico Chico, all right? The name Mexico Chico means something, of course. It's a forgotten frontier which now funnels drugs westward through Chilean ports to Asia. So the point there is, like in the Chapare and like elsewhere, where the state is absent, organized crime rules. And by the way, in Mexico Chico, it's the Clan del Golfo, which is extraordinarily involved. Together, these zones show what Bolivia became, a nodal state in a continental network of transnational organized crime. So this is, now let me focus on sort of the recommendation part here. This is an opportunity for leadership, for Bolivian leadership. Because I think geography is destiny, but only if a nation accepts it, okay? Bolivia's position at the center of South America can become a strategic advantage, right? As the political cycle of narco-authoritarianism ends, the next administration can inaugurate a new era of democratic and regional leadership. So leadership in this sense, whether it's Rodrigo Paz or Tuto Quiroga, means acting first, not waiting for others, all right? So in that sense, among the things I would tell both of these people is, why not convene a South American summit on transnational crime, bringing together the affected nations? Why not invite regional partners, the United States, the European Union, even China, Mexico, Italy, and so on, who are, in fact, whose criminal networks intersect with Bolivia's? Why not renew and work hand in hand with multilateral organizations, the UNODC, the UN, the OAS, and so on, to create a framework for intelligence, some of which was being developed in the late 90s, right, and which has kind of collapsed. And why not come up with a South American Center for Organized Crime Coordination, right? Maybe even in Bolivia, right? In my view, this is not utopian. It is bold, but it's really practical diplomacy that turns Bolivia's centrality into regional leadership. So in conclusion, how do we go from a hub of trafficking to a hub of solutions? On November 8th, the president is going to face this defining choice. Bolivia can remain a hub for traffickers, or it can become the hub for cooperation and reform. If it calls on its neighbors, if it engages global partners, if it reclaims the integrity of its institutions, Bolivia can replace 2 lost decades of narco-authoritarianism with an era of sovereign leadership. After 20 turbulent years, the message, I think, should be simple. Bolivia's new leadership should be ready not only to end narco-authoritarianism, but also end the fight against the transnational crime hub that this movement has left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eduardo. Gracias, Eduardo. I got to tell you something. I got to use AI to simplify the next introduction because her experience and all her achievement will take the next 2 hours. So I'm very privileged to introduce Ivonne Baki, who was designated as the first women ambassador of Ecuador to the United States. She's also an accomplished artist, diplomat, peace negotiator, and humanist. Educated at Sorbonne and Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, she speaks 5 languages, has devoted her life to building bridges between cultures through art, dialogue, and diplomacy, and hard work. She has held numerous high-level positions, including Minister of Foreign Trade, President of the Andean Parliament, and UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for the Dialogue of Civilizations. She played a key role in the Ecuador Peace Agreement with some other very famous people here, promoting environmental protection through the Foundation and the Yasumi ITT initiative, and continues to advocate for sustainable development, peace, and cultural understanding worldwide. Ivonne, welcome.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And really, I'm so pleased to be here today in this important subject that is so much needed. And all of you have mentioned before the lack of leadership, the needs that have to be getting together. And the subject said it, organized crime. They are organized. They are organized and we are not. And this is the missing point, that they take advantage of being organized for the bad, for the evil, for creating terror. And once they do it, it's too late for us to come back. But I would like just to speak about how I got back into politics, thanks to my dear president, Jamil Mahuad, who is also Lebanese, like me. And because I was living in Lebanon, I was born in Ecuador, but I was raised in Lebanon and married in Lebanon. The war started in Lebanon. So I saw all the terrorism that they are talking about. I saw how Bashir Gemayel, the elect president of Lebanon, was killed, and how all the problems happened and still are happening. Hopefully, it will be peace soon, thanks to President Trump. So fast forward, I came to Harvard. Mostly, I was an artist, but also my husband was in politics, and I lived all through politics. My father also loved politics, and it's for the peace. I came to Harvard. My art was promoting peace. The foundation we created was the Arts for Peace Through Politics Foundation at Harvard. And my professor was Professor Roger Fisher. And our professor of leadership also, Heifetz, Ronald Heifetz, that because President Mahuad also was there at Harvard. So my aim was to make peace in the Middle East. That was my dream. But the war between Ecuador and Peru started, and my life changed. And that's how we worked together. President Jamil is the president of peace. Thanks to him, we have peace and dollarization, 2 things that Ecuador should be proud of it, and it's the only thing that's keeping us stable. Could you imagine if we didn't have peace with Peru at that time, with the Shining Path, and in the northern part with the FARC, and I am here with my dear president, Andrés Pastrana, who was at the same time when we made the peace also. And having this with the North, now it was going on in Colombia, and Ecuador is not just Colombia, it's Mexico's cartels and it's everyone that you could imagine being there. But the thing that happened when I was the first time ambassador here, I arrived in 1998 just after we signed the historic last border dispute of the hemisphere. And President Clinton was present, and it was one of the guarantor countries, together with Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. It was a historic peace that was signed in Brasilia on the 26th of October, 1998, and I became ambassador the next day here, thanks to President Mahuad. And what happened? The first thing I arrived, Luis Alberto Moreno was ambassador of Colombia, and they invited us to Congress, to the Senate, to speak about Plan Colombia. And I was sitting next to Senator Christopher Dodd and former President Biden, who was a senator, Foreign Relations Committee. And they invited me because of Ecuador, because President Pastrana had given the piece of land on the frontier of Ecuador to the FARC at that time, the 620 kilometers of Ecuador's frontier with Colombia. And there was the Plan Colombia, and we knew that the balloon effect will come to Ecuador. So what will we do? So I was sitting next to them, and I was listening with no experience of what's going on yet. And they were talking about what was going to be happening. And I looked at Senator Dodd. He was my friend before I was ambassador. I said, Chris, what's going to happen to Ecuador? And he said, don't worry, we speak with your president. We'll arrange the things. And it happened. We made the Manta base. Thanks to the vision and the decision-making immediately of how to protect. It was not a military base. It was a protection for the narcos that were coming and were going through our oceans. So they built it, the Manta base, and it was a protected area. And we were going very well in everything that was being worked. Dollarization happened, and when dollarization happened in 2001 was that. Money laundering started happening because of dollarization. So the government fell, which is another mistake of changes in the governments. We have had, I don't know how many presidents in 5 years. I think there were more than 8 or 9 at that time. And then the thing that was mostly difficult is when former President Correa came, the first thing he did was not only open the Ecuador to everyone to come without visas or any conditions, he also closed the Manta base. He cut relations with the United States. He declared persona non grata to the ambassador of the United States and also to the head of the one that was representing the World Bank in Ecuador. He legalized small amounts of drugs. So the youth of Ecuador, whoever they got, they were making them have drugs, so they get contaminated. So we created a society that was going into the wrong direction. So this is the beginning of what was happening. Until, thank God, Lenín Moreno, his vice president, came and realized the reality of what was going on and stopped it. They tried to put him down so many times. He finished his 4 years. Guillermo Lasso came, as you all know, they put him out, also the same groups. And now what's happening with President Noboa, the same thing. So this is the forces of evil, the organized crime, the narco traffic, the terrorists that create terror, whatever you want to call them. This is the moment of leadership. If we don't get united now, it will be too late. And that's why we have to work together. We have to make the world what it needs, because with technology is the danger now. With artificial intelligence, with technology, they could use it even more for the evil if we don't do something us for the good. So I ask everyone, this is a great conference that we have to do more of this. We have to be vocal about that. And I want to end just by saying an applause for President Trump for making peace with Gaza and Israel. I think this is very important. So applause for that. The best is yet to come. Hope for the Venezuela now.
Thank you, Ivonne. I want to introduce now my good friend, Dr. Ricardo Israel. He's a master and doctor in political science of Exeter University. He's a lawyer of the University of Chile and University of Barcelona, former presidential candidate in Chile, and a visiting professor at the University of the United States, England, and Sweden, and also a director of our institute. Welcome, Ricardo.
Well, Thank you for our director, Carlos, for inviting me to make this presentation. Chile is my case. And first, a word because I am reading it. At the Institute, I have discovered that the only way to say something in 5 minutes is bring it right in. One main problem of Palermo, as is known, the 2000 United Nations Convention against Organized Transnational Crime, is that, strangely enough, it lacks a good definition of what precisely means transnational organized crime. Chile is a case of hybrid warfare in which organized crime is used against democracy. It has happened for years without the country reacting against it. This has taken place in government as different as Piñera's center-right in 2018-2022, and the left-wing one of Boris, inaugurated in 2022, being the main factor that for many years Chile has lacked a vision of the problems and potential of the country in strategic terms, because the long term has been lost. Chile does not have an state intelligence institutionality worth of that name. Not now, not during the whole 21st century, because during the 17 years of the Pinochet dictatorship, civilian and military intelligence was used to suppress dissidents and Democrats. And as a result, the only professional intelligence the country has is in the armed forces, with the limitation that they are legally forbidden to use it for any purpose other than war. It is difficult to understand why after so many years the situation has not been solved. Lacking a true intelligence service has been bad for the country and the state, and both transnational organized crime and national organized crime have taken advantage. First, the country could have lost its democratic system when, surprisingly, in October 2019, an acute violence erupted in the streets. And as a consequence, a constitutional process was started which proposed a radical new constitution to completely change the country that has evolved since independence for 2 centuries. Happily, the Chileans rejected it in a plebiscite, but the Boris government was elected as part of that political climate. In the violence, a very prominent role was played by the so-called first line of young soldiers of drug trafficking. Secondly, for around 3 decades, Chile has had a low-intensity guerrilla warfare in the south of the country. It was presented as a reivindication of the Mapuche ethnic minority, but in the past has had links with the Colombian FARC guerrilla, and today with drug and illicit timber trafficking by white gangs. In any case, there are places in that region where the state is totally absent. Thirdly, the structural weakness of the country was such that the Venezuelan dictatorship took advantage, and organized crime was used to kidnap, torture, and murder Lieutenant Ojeda, a military dissident who had been granted political asylum. The Tren of Aragua was used and paid for this crime. Until then, it was not clear to everyone how deep was the relationship between organized crime and foreign intrusion. But after this killing, there was no doubt, because it was clear to everyone how weak was the Chile and the system which was supposed to protect the country. At the end, the system for criminal prosecution, who is independent, got evidence that the one behind the murder was no one else than Diosdado Cabello himself. Information that was taken to the International Criminal Court by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs without any answer to this date. In any case, the judicial process is alive, and only last week, 3 members of the Tren of Aragua were extradited from the United States to Chile. Today, the country is suffering clear signs of penetration of transnational organized crime in several areas. First, in everyday life and culture, a sign of which is how daily activities like transport and schools cannot take place when streets are taken by narco funerals, which, by the way, are broadcast live by national TV. Second, the sicariato is today part of Chile, with substantial amount of guns and murderers being in their hands. And the related crime frequently takes place when kidnappings for ransom have become the new normal in the country. Lastly, as a drug transit country, Chilean ports have consolidated as a preferred route to send Bolivian and Peruvian cocaine to Europe, at the same time that per capita drug consumption in Chile is higher than Colombia. Transnational organized crime is big business in such a way that they have taken over the northern border for illegal immigration purposes. And also, as a business, there are massive land grabs in which thousands of poor Chileans and poor immigrants are sold land by organizers, mostly drug gangs. It has had also political consequence. This November, there are presidential elections in Chile, next month, and the feeling of insecurity is such that has become the #1 issue to decide winners and losers in the general elections. And according to the new polls, the new president will be one of the 3 right-wing candidates defeating the left. Another political outcome already took place because the criminal activity sponsored by Venezuela and the permanent rhetoric from Caracas produce a political distancing between someone who had been in the past a supporter of Chavismo, as was the case of President Boric, who started to blame Maduro for many of the problems, so he called Venezuela a dictatorship, though he has never said nothing against the mother of all dictatorship, as it is the Cuban Revolution. In Chile, and with this I finish, it was drug trafficking which changed criminal activity because it started to have territorial control and better arms than the police, at the same time that corruption made its way to local governments and municipalities, with politicians having close ties with organized crimes. And common to the rest of the region, the country as such and the political class have not been able neither to have public policies nor the will to successfully defeat organized crime. Democracy and its quality are already losing the battle as is happening in other countries. Audacity and more regional solidarity among democracies is urgently needed, as it's also to look to the United States as a partner and not as a foe. And thank you.
Gracias, Ricardo. Thank you. Now I'm going to introduce Hector Schamis. He's a professor at Georgetown University in Washington. He taught at Brown and Cornell University. He was a fellow at Woodrow Wilson Center, also in Washington, and a visiting researcher at Cambridge University and the Central European University in Budapest. He's the author of books and academic articles on privatization and state reform, authoritarianism, populism, democratization, human rights, among other topics. And he's published, and he's also a columnist of Infobae and an NTN 24 International. He has a doctorate in political science from Columbia University in New York. Welcome, Hector.
Well, thank you. Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Carlos. I was the last minute invited yesterday, so I'm sort of colado with a few notes here. And I'll do my best. I don't have, like Ricardo, the text timed to 5 minutes. So here I go. Let me start with, my talk is resource wars in Latin America. There's a whole literature on Africa and resource wars. Paul Collier coined the term conflict trap, linking natural resource export-oriented economies, intensive in natural resources, the resource curse that exposed to fluctuations in prices and therefore boom bust, to cycles of violence. When the economy expands, there is welfare, but when there is changes in prices and the economy bust, there is activities that are more prone to violence. You see coltan in the DRC, oil in Nigeria, diamonds in Sierra Leone. Those are the resource wars. Now, what happens when all those natural resources are illicit? The problem is compounded, for sure. What happens when the natural resource traded is cocaine, or gasoline smuggling, or illegal mining? All legal goods, or illegal per se, or in the way they were exploited. Well, here's the reality in Latin America. And let me just, they were mentioned, but let me remind everybody of a few examples, recent examples. Let's look at the Catatumbo region, where there's been war in March between dissident FARC and ELN. Fractions and factions, dissidents of dissidents, whose goal is to control the cocaine hub and the mineral resources in that area. Let's look at Ecuador, where cycles of violence have permeated and poisoned political life. Someone mentioned the assassination of Fernando Villavicencio as a prime example of brutal violence. And just now, we hear Ivonne about the Correa period. Let's look at, of course, Venezuela, that has been labeled a narco-terrorist regime, not just now, but in 2020 by the Department of Justice. And the indictment has been in the docs ever since. Now, the State Department picked it up and added a wave of, we may say, political pressure to a legal case that had already existed. Let's look at Mexico, where it's a legend, the activities of the cartels. But think about this. Mexico is a federal country. Carlos talked about federalism. Mexico is a federal country, also very strong federalism. But how about the names of the cartels? It's a federal structure of cartel activities. Sinaloa, cartel. Jalisco, New Generation, cartel. New Michoacan Family, cartel. Well, the illegal activities reproduce the institutions of the country in a very, if you want, perverse way, in a very funny but perverse funny. But think about the future of our region. Think about lithium. A hub of lithium up in the Andes, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. A boom of no precedent, but cocaine growing and smuggling next door in Bolivia. Think about rare earth minerals. The DR presumably has the largest reserve of rare earth minerals in the world. If confirmed, it will be about 90% out of this world. That's a state, a normal state. But think about the neighbor. The deposits of rare earth minerals in the DR are in the Pedernales province, which is right next to Haiti, a state captured by criminal gangs. That's the reality of our region. We need to look at two things. First, states in charge of criminal organizations are no longer states. They are just criminal organizations. And to grant them political status is misleading. It serves to rehabilitate them, it serves to normalize them, and ultimately legitimize. Maduro is a dictator. That's a brutal authoritarian regime. That's good for them. It's good because there are many authoritarian regimes in the world, and those states are legitimate actors. North Korea, Russia, Iran. This is a different category, and we shouldn't give them the benefit of rehabilitation. There is something else, and I'm concluding. This is a political regime. Crime is beyond corruption. Corruption has initially, or does initially, fuel and finance criminal activities, but it takes over. Corruption is not enough of a term because it's ultimately benign. Corruption refers to a public official who keeps 10% for his pocket. No, this is a different thing. This is a state, a parallel state. This is a different form of sovereignty. Let me conclude. In almost every country, with a paper I wrote recently, in almost every country of the region, the map of the state as a bureaucratic and legal apparatus has rarely overlapped with the political map. Large swaths of statelessness in our continent. But in large regions of the region, the state is absent today. It is private actors, actually. Eduardo Gamarra mentioned the absentee state. It is private actors who administer justice, collect taxes, and control the means of violence. A corrupt version of all this, that is. Drug and human traffickers, guerrillas, illegal miners, and a conglomerate of all of these warlords compete with the state for territorial control and ultimately sovereignty. Now, you know that Latin America is the most violent region in the world, a region that CELAC in 2014 declared region of peace. Wishful thinking, for sure. 15 of the top 20 most homicidal cities in the world are in Latin America. And with 8.1% of the population, world population, Latin America accounts for 26% of the planet's violent deaths. That is the war. A war that we are losing day by day and that we are victimized day by day throughout the region. I remember years ago, well, it was Colombia, it was Medellin. Well, no, it's the region as a whole. And the wars is one more thing. Ricardo mentioned Chile and Tren de Aragua. Is Tren de Aragua capable of taking over the US? Certainly not. But it's capable of doing a lot of damage. And talk about violation of sovereignty and a war of aggression, right? We talk about wars of aggression, Russia taking over Ukraine. But the operation, the Tren de Aragua in Chile, violating sovereignty, an aggression to the Chilean government, and committing a crime on an exile, which is a decision by the government to grant exile to somebody, Teniente Ojeda, is an example of that war. And if we don't wake up, we're going to lose the war even worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Hector. I want to introduce now Dr. Evan Ellis. He is a senior non-resident fellow with the Center for Strategic and International Studies with a focus on Latin American security issues, including organized crime and the role of extra-hemispheric U.S. adversaries in the region. He has published over 600 works, including 5 books, and from 2019 and 2020 he serves on the Secretary of State of Policy Planning and Staff with responsibility for Western Hemisphere affairs. Dr. Ellis, welcome.
Well, first of all, it's not easy to be the last speaker after so many distinguished speakers have done so much good analysis. I think what I'm going to try to do is maybe touch on some new points, but also summarize much of what is said today. But first of all, also just recognizing the very high-level representation of my colleagues, and certainly I'd be remiss not to acknowledge, with President Mahuad here, with President Pastrana here, with Vice President Santos here, with Ambassador Baki here, with
Secretary General Almagro here. Just a real honor and very difficult to present new ideas with such a distinguished group, but I'm going to try. I also, in the interest of keeping within my 5 minutes, have used prepared remarks, so forgive me if it's a little bit less dynamic, but I want to try to keep as much as possible within time. So first, let me just start out by saying that organized crime in the region, including the global networks to which they're connected, as we've talked about, is for me the single biggest threat beyond the People's Republic of China to U.S. security and prosperity. Looking at the U.S., I'd like to start by saying those impacts are far more significant and complex than is commonly understood. As we've seen with Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, the principal source of fentanyl, and 70,000 of the more than 110,000 drug overdose deaths here per year, organized crime brings drugs that kill more Americans than virtually any other non-medical cause. As we've also seen with Tren de Aragua, organized crime also preys on desperate migrants, bringing crime and violence to U.S. cities, among others. Beyond these direct effects, it foments corruption and violence, as we've talked about, in the societies where it operates. This, of course, as we've seen, leads to economic malaise, institutional failure, and political discontent. These, in turn, in this cycle, drive migration, impacting not only the U.S., but virtually every other country in our region. More indirectly, but importantly, citizen discontent with the performance of those distorted economies and damaged democratic institutions opens the door for the capture of power by anti-U.S. populists, as we've seen with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, with Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, with Rafael Correa in Ecuador, with Evo Morales in Bolivia, among others. Citizen disillusionment with corrupted democracies weakens also their resistance as those authoritarians, bit by bit, consolidate power by bending or ignoring the rules. As they consolidate power, anti-U.S. authoritarians also cut cooperation with the U.S. and others in law enforcement, extradition, intelligence, and other areas. That, even more, gives organized crime a safe haven in their countries, often benefiting it from themselves, those leaders, as we've seen with persons like Maduro. From these authoritarian sanctuaries, organized crime is then able to consolidate and penetrate neighbors, such as Colombia, including through both illicit commerce as well as through those destabilizing refugee flows. Moreover, the criminally empowered anti-U.S. authoritarians also embrace, as we've seen, problematic relationships with anti-U.S. adversaries, such as the PRC, such as Russia, such as Iran. And those actors, in turn, provide the authoritarians with the resources, with the military and the digital tools, and also the political cover to continue their reign. Continuing, for me, it's also important to understand the context and the extent and the complexity of these evolving dynamics of organized crime. First, just talking a little bit about what we've already discussed, the conditions we find ourselves in. Latin America and the Caribbean are currently awash in cocaine. The land under cocoa cultivation in Colombia has increased from 40,000 hectares to over 250,000 today. Last year, of course, in Colombia, cocaine production increased by 53% alone. Neighboring Venezuela has devolved, importantly, from a transit country largely for Colombian cocaine to also a producer with laboratories. In Peru, cocoa production has spread from the Vraim, the Mantaro, Apurumac, and Any River valleys into the jungle lowlands bordering Colombia, Brazil, and Bolivia. In addition to Colombian groups and to Mexico's Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación cartels, as we've talked about, Brazil's First Capital Command, PCC, and the Red Command, Comando Vermelho, they have increasingly become important in South American routes. Also, as noted previously, with Europe becoming a lucrative market for cocaine, Italy's 'Ndrangheta, Albanian mafias, and various other European groups are also increasingly present. The use, of course, of Ecuador to export Colombian cocaine, as we've seen, has dramatically increased violence and outmigration from that country. Drug flows also through the Caribbean and the availability of small arms have transformed once benign youth gangs there and have produced also enormous violence in the small island states such as Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. Also, technologies available to often cash-flush groups farther contribute to the effectiveness and damage they do. Important to mention narco submarines, low-profile boats, towed buoys, which all traverse Pacific routes from Colombia and Ecuador to Guatemala and Mexico, creating detection and intercepting challenges. Narco subs, however, are also increasingly used in Atlantic transit routes across the Caribbean all the way to Europe. Drones are another expanding problem. They're used for surveillance, for transporting contraband, including into prisons, and also for attacks. The Colombian military has suffered, just in the past year, hundreds of incidents in places like Catatumbo. In Ecuador last year, a large drone attack attempted to blow a hole in the maximum security prison at La Roca. A Mexican general was almost killed earlier this year in a drone attack against his convoy. With gold now over $4,000 an ounce, it was $3,000 last week when I wrote this, but now over $4,000 an ounce. In some countries, illegal mining has now surpassed drugs as an illegal revenue source and is often used to launder money. The Orinoco Basin of Venezuela, the interior of Colombia, Suriname, Guyana, Peru, and Bolivia are particularly problematic areas. With respect to immigration, the massive displacement of Venezuela, more than 8 million as we've seen, but also Ecuadorians, Haitians, Cubans, and others have all facilitated the spread of violent criminal groups such as, but not only, Tren de Aragua. It's also important to note that splinter groups now within Tren de Aragua are now emerging, and also local groups in the region are copying the violent techniques of Tren de Aragua and these others, farther expanding the violence. And approaching the end, the expanding presence of PRC-based companies, banks, and individuals in the region has also complicated the fight against organized criminality. The PRC is, and it's important to recognize, the leading source of precursor chemicals for fentanyl and other synthetic drugs. And also PRC-based companies and banks are increasingly used for money laundering, creating problems for financial intelligence units and also analytical opportunities for that other FIU. With respect to solutions at home, for me, a focus on illicit money flows is key, as well as extradition and expanded cooperation, as my colleagues have noted. This includes intelligence sharing, more joint operations, and helping our partners to combat corruption and strengthen the technical capabilities of their police and judicial institutions. For me, and to say the obvious, it is also vital not to permit regimes such as those of Venezuela to continue to serve as sanctuaries for criminal groups. If we end with just going after drug boats and not the root causes of the problem, we are stopping far short of what we need to do. Finally, I do welcome the possibility that the increased attention from the current U.S. administration to the role of this region for U.S. security can also translate into more effective cooperation to combat this pernicious and destabilizing challenge of organized crime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you to all the presenters. I think we have a fantastic morning. We are going to continue now. I'm glad to introduce Roman Leitman. He is the chief correspondent for Infobae in Washington. Roman.
Bueno, lo que les decía antes que hiciéramos el break, Carlos tomó una decisión geopolítica que es, si vamos a hablar de crimen organizado en América Latina, bueno, hablemos en español, ¿no? Aunque sea el segundo bloque, honramos la lengua de Borges o Gabriel García Márquez o cualquiera de los autores que hayamos leído cuando éramos chicos. Así que gracias, Carlos, por la invitación. Nuestro primer orador en este bloque va a ser Francisco Santos. Para mí tiene una ventaja fundamental, que es periodista, entonces eso le da una categoría especial. Es un hombre de diálogo porque de alguna manera fue el que empujó los diálogos con la FARC. Sufrió un secuestro cuando Pablo Escobar era el líder más reconocido de los grupos criminales en la región y finalmente, haciendo honor a su vocación política, fue vicepresidente de Álvaro Uribe, o sea que tiene mucho para contar, mucho para explicar. Obviamente, tratándose de estadistas, uno no puede limitarlos el tiempo, pero apelando a su experiencia histórica, supongamos que estamos en Naciones Unidas o en el G20, por favor, no más de 8 minutos. Naciones Unidas son 15, pero como acá después todos tenemos que trabajar, además de esto, o sea, si pueden ser 8 o 10 minutos, sería fantástico. Así que, Francisco Santos, todo tuyo.
Gracias. Bueno, ¿está prendido? Sí, muchas gracias. El narcotráfico hoy se ha convertido en la amenaza más grande a la democracia en el continente, no les quepa la menor duda. Y cuando miramos en perspectiva histórica, vemos que en los últimos 20 años el narcotráfico se cambió, y sobre todo el crimen organizado. Y se transformó y se ha convertido en esta amenaza gigante por 4 razones fundamentales. La primera, cuando Felipe Calderón ataca, que además tenía que hacerlo, a los carteles mexicanos, después de décadas en las que los gobernantes miraban para otro lado y el narcotráfico enquistado en México hacía lo que le daba la gana, los narcos mexicanos dicen, venga, yo necesito empezar a desarrollar nuevos mercados, y se empiezan a meter por toda América Latina. Hoy operan desde el Río Grande hasta la Patagonia, sobre todo en el Pacífico. ¿Y qué hacen esos carteles mexicanos? Primero usan redes criminales locales, las empoderan, las hacen crecer, imponen su modelo de violencia, imponen un modelo de control político que ellos ya aprendieron, lo llevan haciendo en México mucho tiempo, y están empezando a hacer algo muy importante que poco a poco crece, que es la legalización de los negocios. Los carteles mexicanos son dueños del negocio del aguacate, son dueños a través de internet del negocio del limón, son dueños del negocio de la construcción en México. Entonces están empezando a generar ese nuevo elemento que hace parte ya de una cadena criminal. Y este fortalecimiento de mafias locales los ha convertido un poco en el Amazon del negocio de la droga en toda América Latina. Segundo, la llegada de las mafias de otras partes del mundo. La principal, Hezbollah, que estaba desde hace mucho tiempo en la triple frontera, pero con con Venezuela, expande muchísimo su accionar, y no solo en narcotráfico, en minería ilegal. La mafia albanesa llega a Ecuador, como bien lo dijeron, con el beneplácito de Rafael Correa. La mafia rusa se instala en Venezuela, y ojo que la mafia china está creciendo y creciendo y creciendo su presencia en América Latina. Lavado de activos, muchos están operando desde México hasta Argentina. Los temas son lavado de activos, tema de precursores químicos, contrabando, están muy metidos en el negocio del contrabando, y en el tráfico ilegal de personas y de fauna. Todas estas nuevas organizaciones criminales cada vez están trabajando de una manera más compenetrada, y ojo que los chinos, los rusos y los iraníes tienen también un elemento geopolítico y geoestratégico a su accionar. Tercero, la consolidación de narcoestados. Venezuela es el mejor caso. Ahí operan libremente todas estas mafias anteriormente mencionadas, y hay que sumarle los carteles colombianos, especialmente el cartel del Golfo, hay que sumarles la FARC y el ELN, que operan con toda tranquilidad desde allá. Y claramente el cartel de los soles, que es un instrumento que creó Chávez hace 20 años, poco más de 20 años, o sea, hace más de 20 años, y esto es creación de Chávez, esto no es que se lo inventaron, y lo consolida Maduro y su cleptocracia mafiosa. Lo que pasó en Colombia, no podemos olvidarnos de lo que pasó en Colombia. El presidente Santos en el 2013 para el Plan Colombia, y de 40.000 hectáreas al 2018 pasamos a 200.000. Desmontó toda la lucha antinarcóticos en Colombia. El presidente Duque desafortunadamente no hizo mucho para reducirlo, y tenemos ahora a Petro, que es el mejor aliado de los narcotraficantes. Los saca de las cárceles y los lleva a eventos públicos donde él está. Les tiene un proyecto de ley que les genera unas garantías y unas amnistías, prácticamente amnistías que son aterradoras. La coca pasó de 200.000 hectáreas, Duque la mantuvo en 200.000, no es un gran trabajo, tengo que ser serio, a 270 estar ahora. Y la producción de coca pasó de más o menos 1.600 toneladas métricas a 2.700 toneladas métricas en este gobierno. O sea, el mejor amigo de los narcos y los criminales se llama Gustavo Petro. Y México es casi un narcoestado, contrario a lo que dice mi querida amiga Beatrice. En la mitad de los estados mexicanos, los narcos son los que ponen gobernador, ponen alcalde, usted se puede mover para allá, usted no se puede mover. como les decía antes, controlan estas industrias. Obviamente es un país demasiado grande que es demasiado poderoso, entonces esto a veces se pierde, pero con la política de abrazos y no balazos de AMLO, se integró esta criminalidad organizada a un proyecto político, el de Morena, que es lo que Petro quiere hacer en Colombia con los narcos. Ojo, esto ya viene de antes y esto tiene, digamos, ese nuevo instrumento. Y cuarto, igualmente importante, la complicidad de Estados Unidos. Ayer hablábamos sobre cómo mucho de lo que hicieron en Bolivia lo desmontaron, pero afortunadamente hoy el presidente Trump entendió que esta es una amenaza de interés nacional y que estas son organizaciones criminales transnacionales terroristas. Es un cambio gigantesco en la lucha contra el narcotráfico y eso es muy importante. Pero quiero darle dos ejemplos de mi país de cómo Estados Unidos fue cómplice. Primero, cuando Santos desmontó el Plan Colombia y pasaron las hectáreas en 5 años de 40.000 a 100.000, ¿dijeron algo? Nada. Obama fue cómplice. La administración Obama fue cómplice de ese proceso que, entre otras, ustedes, los ecuatorianos, están viviendo las consecuencias, porque el 70% de ese cultivo está en la frontera con ustedes y todo ese narcotráfico se fue para allá. Y lo segundo, cuando llega Petro, Biden dice, ay, ya no vamos a medir más las hectáreas de coca. ¿Qué pasa? De 200.000 a 270.000. Eso es parte de las decisiones que no pueden tener los países cuando un proyecto que ya demostró que es exitoso, como lo fue el Plan Colombia, necesita que se mantenga, que trascienda, y Estados Unidos debe ser uno de los instrumentos más importantes en mantener esa dirección y no cambiarla, por cierto. Y quiero terminar con un qué viene, pero qué viene para mi país, para Colombia, en términos de lucha contra las drogas. Por primera vez la tecnología es la gran aliada, porque usted con drones puede generar una fumigación gigantesca de todos los cultivos de coca a un costo infinitamente menor que volar aviones y volar helicópteros, y a un costo humano infinitamente menor, y además sin el tema de aspersión, daño ambiental, porque usted casi que lo focaliza. Obviamente hay que tener una política social muy agresiva en ese sentido, porque usted tampoco puede dejar a los campesinos, sí, ir contra los narcos, para los campesinos sin que vivir, pero los drones son hoy un instrumento fundamental, que si usted le suma lo que Estados Unidos está sacando ahorita, que es un avión solar, que puede permanecer volando meses sin tener que aterrizar, y usted le coloca todo tipo de radares e instrumentos que le guíen, puede controlar ríos. Imagínense un avión de esos por todo el Pacífico colombiano, la belleza, lo que podría hacer. Puede controlar mares, puede de verdad generar un control territorial a un bajo costo que le quita todo ese espacio en el que hoy operan los narcotraficantes. Lo cierto es que lo de hoy, lo que hemos hablado, muestra un camino difícil, un camino donde se va a necesitar integración. Hoy no puede haber integración de la lucha. Petro no le va a jalar a nada de eso, a pesar de que usted tiene un presidente que lo haría en Ecuador, yo creo que en Perú también, en Argentina lo harían, pero usted necesita voluntad política que hoy el gobierno colombiano no tiene. Muchas gracias. ¿Me pasé?
Bueno, ahora va a participar el presidente de Ecuador, Jorge Mahuad. Ustedes saben que yo me acuerdo hace ya 1.000.000 de años había un presidente llamado Carlos Menem, y me acuerdo de una anécdota que me contó Menem sobre usted, presidente, porque claro, Argentina había estado involucrada de alguna manera en el conflicto de Perú con Ecuador. Y él al final fue a la firma que usted empujó para el acuerdo de paz. Y yo decía, pero presidente, o sea, sabemos lo que pasó con las armas. ¿Usted va a la firma del acuerdo? Me dice, sí, por supuesto, porque el presidente de Ecuador es buenísimo, Román. Bueno, así que me acordé cuando me confirmaron que usted venía, me acordé y me parece un hecho absolutamente destacado, teniendo en cuenta además que sufrió un golpe de Estado en una situación muy compleja. Si apelamos a la memoria de cada uno de nosotros, se cayeron los commodities, había crisis doméstica y los militares, en lugar de responder a la Constitución, hicieron el golpe de Estado. Así que el piso suyo es su momento, presidente.
Muchas gracias. Gracias a todas las instituciones que nos invitan a estar aquí. En esto de noticias buenas y malas, muchas gracias por las palabras. La parte mala es que fue hace millones de años, como dijo usted, y me ha hecho acordar qué viejos que estamos. Bien, el Ecuador siempre fue considerado una isla de paz en América. ¿Cómo hacer para que una isla de paz se convierta en un país que compite por ser el más violento en América Latina en poco tiempo? La receta es muy fácil: elijan al gobierno adecuado. Ecuador eligió a Rafael Correa. Y Correa primero decidió hacer una alianza con el crimen organizado para destruir la democracia en América Latina. Coincido totalmente con la primera frase de Francisco, de que la peor amenaza para nosotros y la democracia es el narcotráfico. Y empezó a actuar. Primero recibió contribuciones de las FARC para su campaña electoral, en dinero. Segundo, presidió el Consejo de Seguridad Nacional del Ecuador y dejó establecido, como consta en las actas, que el problema del narcotráfico es un problema de los consumidores, allá que lo arreglen los gringos. Los países productores no tienen nada que hacer ahí. Luego invitó a todos los carteles del mundo a que vengan al país, con aquella teoría de la hermandad universal, de la ciudadanía universal. Para entrar al Ecuador no hacía falta visa, ni chequeos de récords policiales, ni se prestaba ninguna atención a notificaciones de Interpol. Todos eran bienvenidos. Y cuando le dijo al mundo que Ecuador arrancaba esta cruzada para que todos seamos hermanos, el mundo le dijo, él esperaba reciprocidad, el mundo le dijo gracias. Y Ecuador se convirtió en el país donde se podía entrar y nadie siguió con esa política después. Cuando ya estaban adentro, tuvo que debilitar los controles para que pudieran trabajar mejor. Destruyó unidades de inteligencia, equipos que se dañaban no fueron mantenidos ni reemplazados. Volvió a una frontera totalmente porosa, como es la frontera de nosotros con Colombia, en un paso libre de un lado para el otro. El lema del gobierno era: construimos carreteras que llevaban a los puertos de donde se empezó a exportar la droga. Se pavimentó el proceso. Y todo eso con la retórica del nacionalismo y de la defensa de la institucionalidad. Se incorporó al modelo de negocio de los narcotraficantes. El 90% de la producción de cocaína en el mundo viene de 3 países: Colombia, Bolivia y Perú. Producen, refinan, almacenan, pero por el Plan Colombia, que tan bien funcionó, la exportación se volvió difícil. Entonces lo más fácil era transportarla al Ecuador. Tenemos miles de kilómetros de playas de muy fácil acceso, donde una lancha pequeña llega, se la carga y se va. Y Ecuador entró en ese proceso. Había un problema. Cuando fui presidente firmamos un convenio con los Estados Unidos para que una base ecuatoriana, 100% ecuatoriana, base de la Fuerza Aérea Ecuatoriana, pudiera ser utilizada por aviones norteamericanos para hacer el surveillance desde el aire de lanchas y de aviones más pequeños. Tenían que reportar cuándo llegaban, qué tipo de aviones, qué tripulaciones, cuántos se quedaban. Hicieron inversiones para poder operar en una provincia destruida por el fenómeno del Niño. Fue una ganancia para ambos lados. Y ese convenio tenía 10 años. Al cumplirse el 10º año, Correa no lo renovó, con la retórica del nacionalismo y de la soberanía. Por último, está bien, no lo renueve, pero ponga algo a cambio. No puso nada. Y entonces el Pacífico se convirtió en una avenida amplia para mandar droga hacia el norte. Todo eso funcionó con él. ¿Y ahora qué nos toca? Nos toca destruir esta construcción que él generó. Primero, en la definición del problema. Correa definió el problema del narcotráfico como un problema de salud pública, no como un problema de seguridad nacional. Había que combatirlo con hospitales, psiquiatras, buenas políticas públicas. Ahora tenemos que definirlo, como se va definiendo ya en muchos países, como un problema de seguridad nacional, Si lo declaran problema de seguridad nacional, puede entrar el ejército con fuerza. Pueden tratar como narcoterroristas a quienes actúan. Pueden tratarlos como combatientes de un enemigo estatal. Segundo, hay que volver a todos los controles y con fuerza. Hay que controlar la producción, la refinación, el transporte, la exportación. Hay que detener, mandar a prisión, confiscar, seguir la ruta del dinero, por supuesto. Todo eso hay que hacer. Hay que hacerlo de manera internacional y organizada, como decía Ivonne. Ellos están como una estructura totalmente funcional, con mucho entrenamiento. Y nosotros, cada un país por su lado, que fue otra de las propuestas de Correa, no una alianza y una red internacional que necesitamos. Tenemos que ir por ahí y necesitamos cooperación y dinero, inteligencia, equipos, gente y la voluntad nacional en cada país de entrar en esta guerra, que como toda guerra será larga, será sangrienta, tomará muchísima determinación, pero sin eso no se sale. Y para cerrar, cumpliendo con el tiempo, podemos optar entre dos, parafraseando 2 veces al gran García Márquez. O asistimos a la crónica de la muerte anunciada de la democracia en América Latina, o pensamos que en los 23 millones de kilómetros cuadrados de América, las generaciones condenadas a 100 años de soledad todavía tendrán una segunda oportunidad en esta tierra. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, usando, como dijo el presidente Gabriel García Márquez, podemos plantearnos en ese contexto que en realidad es como el amor en los tiempos de cólera, que tuvo una segunda oportunidad, ¿no? Se subió al barco, iban y venía, Daza y su novia de la adolescencia, y al final se encontraron. Bueno, le toca el turno a Andrés Pastrana. Tiene un currículum tremendo. Yo podría decir que fue senador, fue intendente en Bogotá y presidente de Colombia, y en ese contexto puedo explicar como pocos las relaciones entre el poder real o el sotogobierno con la corrupción y el narcotráfico y las vinculaciones. Así que es su turno, Andrés Pastrana.
Gracias. Bueno, yo también me siento muy orgulloso de haber sido periodista, colega de Pacho y tuyo también, ¿no?
Sí,
¿Ah?
me honra.
Sí.
Yo vine de casualidad.
A ver, Carlos nos dijo que teníamos que ser muy cortos, así que yo me permití escribir algo. Quiero primero agradecer al Inter-American Institute for Democracy, a Infobae, a FIU y a la Universidad Austral por esta invitación. Y Carlos, muchas gracias por haber pensado en nosotros. Señor presidente Mahuad, señor vicepresidente Santos, señor secretario Almagro, queridos embajadores y queridas amigas y amigos. Qué bueno poder hablar hoy yo de algo que ahora comienza a tocarse después de 22 años de haber salido de la presidencia. Yo digo que comienza a hacerse un reconocimiento a la labor que hicimos nosotros desde el gobierno. Y a mí eso nos pasa, a ti te pasó con la dolarización, a mí me está pasando con el Plan Colombia. ¿Ok? Y creo que esto es importante. Miremos de dónde venimos. El consumo de cocaína en los Estados Unidos tuvo un pico impresionante en la década de 1980 a 1990. Miremos qué pasaba en los Estados Unidos. El consumo entre el grupo de población entre 18 y 25 años llegó al 10%, generando una preocupación muy grande en el gobierno de los Estados Unidos. La gente se comenzó a preguntar, y el gobierno, ¿estarían los Estados Unidos a las puertas de una crisis de adicción? ¿Los números de consumidores y de adictos a la cocaína seguirían creciendo tan aceleradamente? Y en ese contexto, bajo el presidente Ronald Reagan, declara la guerra a las drogas. Reagan escala dramáticamente lo que denominó War on Drugs, enfatizando como políticas la criminalización, mínimos mandatorios, cero tolerancia, y esto culminó
el Anti-Drug Abuse Act de 1986 y de 1988. Ese aumento del consumo tan acelerado generó en Colombia un negocio ilegal de grandes proporciones, negocios que lograron concentrar, aquí Héctor, cartel de Medellín, bajo Pablo Escobar y los hermanos Ochoa, y bajo el cartel de Cali, bajo los hermanos Rodríguez Orejuela. Pero miremos el contexto. Para darle una idea del poder que tenían los carteles, el PIB de Colombia hacia 1988 era solamente de 44 billones de dólares. Un país muy pobre en términos relativos, y los recursos ilegales que estaban entrando a Colombia eran cercanos a los 5 billones de dólares. Si ustedes hacen el cuenta de que más o menos gastábamos nosotros 2.5% en gasto militar, casi nos doblaba la plata que entraba a los carteles. Entonces no es de extrañar que esos carteles infiltraron la justicia, la policía, la política, generaron una ola de terror en un intento por presionar al gobierno de Colombia, que tuvo como consecuencia el asesinato de 3 candidatos presidenciales en 1989, que me tocó enterrarlos a mí cuando yo era alcalde mayor de Bogotá, y el secuestro de muchos periodistas, policías, jueces, abogados, inclusive el mío propio de manos de Pablo Escobar, como el de Pacho de manos de Pablo Escobar. Hoy aquí estamos los únicos 2 sobrevivientes a el secuestro de Pablo Escobar, Pacho y yo. Somos los únicos 2 sobrevivientes en Colombia de un secuestro de Pablo Escobar. En mi concepto, esa desproporción entre el inmenso dinero de los carteles frente a los pequeños recursos de Colombia es lo que explica la creciente desestabilización de Colombia durante la década de los 80 y de los 90. Esto obviamente está unido a la difícil topografía colombiana que históricamente ha hecho muy difícil el control de su territorio. El 55% del territorio de Colombia concentra apenas el 5% de nuestra población, y fue en esos territorios despoblados donde primero se propagó la hoja de coca y la producción de cocaína. Con las ayudas del presidente Clinton comenzando y después del presidente Bush y de los Estados Unidos en su totalidad, a finales de los 80 el gobierno enfrentó y golpeó duramente a los 2 grandes carteles. Pero ¿qué pasó? Que mientras tanto las FARC como los paramilitares crecieron rápidamente entre el año 1985 y el año 2000, porque entraron de manera plena en el negocio del narcotráfico y aprovecharon, óigase bien, la poquísima presencia del Estado en territorios como el Putumayo, Guaviare y el Caquetá. Ya para el año 1988, cuando fui elegido presidente de Colombia, había 180.000 hectáreas de coca sembradas. La mayoría de ellas en esos territorios con poquísima presencia estatal, y de las FARC y de los paramilitares se enfrentaban precisamente por el control del negocio del narcotráfico, hasta el punto que Colombia, como ya lo definían los Estados Unidos, estaba a punto de convertirse en un Estado fallido. ¿Qué pasó? Me ideo el Plan Colombia, le presento al presidente Clinton, reitero, y después al presidente Bush, el Plan Colombia. Se lo presento también a Europa en su momento. ¿Qué pasó? Que el Plan Colombia, logró ese cambio importantísimo en esa tendencia de violencia y narcotráfico. Estados Unidos acepta por primera vez que los dineros ilegales provenientes del narcotráfico habían destabilizado a Colombia y que se hacía necesario modificar la estrategia que hasta ese momento se había aplicado en mi país, bajo lo que yo denominé la nueva política de responsabilidad compartida, es decir, entre países consumidores y países productores. Se buscó conseguir recursos suficientes para enfrentar esa escalada de violencia y la producción y el tráfico de cocaína. Como yo le dije en la primera reunión al presidente Clinton, yo soy el mayor productor de coca, usted es el mayor consumidor. Yo soy un país pobre y usted es un país rico. Usted pondrá recursos y yo pondré recursos. Entonces, el Plan Colombia no solamente aumentó los recursos que Colombia destinó a ¿qué? Fortalecimiento de su ejército y de su policía fundamentalmente, sino que además para este proceso buscamos cómo y de qué forma podíamos tener los dineros de Europa. Al final, Europa no aportó los recursos. Sin embargo, el Plan Colombia logró sumar cerca de 7 billones de dólares en los primeros 4 años y cerca de 13 billones de dólares en los siguientes 5 años. Pero además de los mayores recursos, ¿qué necesitábamos? Se requería de un cambio de estrategia. Hasta 1998, la política de los Estados Unidos para Colombia se había concentrado solo en la fumigación con glifosato, bajo la teoría que era más fácil destruir la hoja de cocaína en los cultivos que atrapar 1 kilo de cocaína refinada en la inmensa frontera de los Estados Unidos. Eso era lo que se trataba. ¿Cómo vamos a la fuente? Pero esta política no había logrado su objetivo y los cultivos seguían creciendo. Con el Plan Colombia, los recursos para enfrentar el narcotráfico se multiplicaron por 10. Se desarrolló una nueva estrategia en donde el control del territorio desde una perspectiva civil y de seguridad se convirtió en el eje central y la fumigación fue uno de los soportes a esa estrategia, pero era la presencia del Estado. El Plan Colombia combinó estratégicamente, primero, brigadas antinarcóticos, unas brigadas equipadas para darle gran movilidad, el fortalecimiento de las instituciones locales, el fortalecimiento de la interdicción, la sustitución de cultivos y la fumigación para lograr en pocos años derrotar en forma contundente a los grupos violentos, tanto a los paramilitares como a las FARC, y reducir los cultivos ilícitos en 2 años de 180.000 a 90.000 y al finalizar el gobierno del presidente Uribe a 40.000 hectáreas. Esto es un éxito sin precedentes en la lucha contra el narcotráfico. Se requirió una ayuda cercana a los 10 billones de dólares y 10 años para que Colombia pudiese estabilizar el país. Eso fue el resultado del Plan Colombia. Fue una política que ha sido exitosa. Si la hubiera continuado Juan Manuel Santos, esas 40.000 hectáreas hubieran desaparecido del país. ¿Qué ocurre hoy después de 25 años del Plan Colombia? Comencemos con el consumo de cocaína. Un reporte de Naciones Unidas del 2001 ya notaba que el consumo de cocaína en Estados Unidos para el año 1999 era 70% más bajo que el pico más alto que se había presentado en el 85. Hoy en los Estados Unidos, la cocaína es la segunda droga ilegal más consumida, aunque ese consumo de cocaína está muy debajo, precisamente, de los índices de 1985. Sin embargo, ¿qué pasó? En el resto del mundo ocurre la situación inversa. El consumo de cocaína, que solo era importante en los Estados Unidos en la década de los 80, ha crecido de manera que algunos países como Nueva Zelanda, como Australia, Gran Bretaña, Holanda y España ya superan en porcentaje de población consumidora a los Estados Unidos. Hoy Europa tiene el 21% del consumo mundial. El consumo de América Latina es también bastante alto, pero para mí lo más preocupante, como ya lo hemos hablado aquí, es que el consumo comienza a crecer en el Asia y en el África. Hoy tenemos 25 millones de consumidores a nivel global y en la medida en que el precio de la cocaína siga bajando, probablemente aumentará más rápidamente los consumidores en el mundo. Colombia producimos el 70% de la hoja de coca. Y para mí, para enfrentar este problema, hoy se requiere el Plan Colombia 2.0. Esta vez, Es una alianza entre consumidores y productores a nivel global. El Plan Colombia número 1 fue financiado ¿por quién? Por Colombia y por Estados Unidos. El nuevo Plan Colombia tiene que ser financiado, además por Europa, también por Japón, por la China, ya que están ellos a las puertas de un aumento importante en su consumo. La estrategia de este nuevo plan no debe ser muy diferente a lo que ya funcionó. Un mayor control del territorio en los países productores y un incremento en la interdicción con énfasis en las rutas del narcotráfico. Es hora de reconocer que este es un negocio transnacional que nos afecta a todos y que demanda una acción concertada de los países productores y de los países consumidores para enfrentarla. Frente al éxito del Plan Colombia, y yo propondría, y aquí ya lo he venido diciendo, se lo dije al presidente Lazo que no oyó esa opinión, porque a esta edad ya no da uno consejos, sino da opiniones, en que le dije, hay que hacer un plan Ecuador. Estamos dispuestos a darle la mano. Y hoy, Beatriz, salido Maduro, como esperamos que el narcodictador salga, hay que hacer un plan Venezuela y unirnos nosotros en este tema. Y reitero que frente al éxito del Plan Colombia hace 20 años, uno de los elementos fundamentales, el Plan Colombia nace en el 2002, en el 2000 la firma, es lo que dejamos como el gran legado al presidente Uribe, y afortunadamente fue Uribe el que nos sucede a nosotros, y por eso logramos llegar, reitero, a las 40.000. Hoy, Pacho, para mí, Colombia puede estar entre las 300 y 400.000 hectáreas, porque precisamente por eso es que Petro ha acabado con cuántas hectáreas estamos produciendo hoy. Hoy, 20 años después del Plan Colombia, los narcotraficantes han reestructurado sus operaciones y han logrado su objetivo de reducir el precio de la cocaína con el ánimo de aumentar su consumo. ¿Cuál es su siguiente objetivo? Es crear el narcoestado en Colombia. Ya el narcotráfico se ha entronizado en Venezuela y con sus inmensos recursos, ellos están intentando entronizarse en Colombia. Yo, para terminar, diría que igual que como hicimos con Pablo Escobar, es necesario derrotarlos ahora. Muchas gracias.
Como último panelista de este bloque, luego Carlos va a hacer los comentarios finales, le toca el turno a Luis Almagro. Yo quiero decir solo una cosa a partir de mi experiencia profesional con él, o sea, como canciller o como embajador en China, como secretario general de la OEA, fue el primero en un organismo multilateral que dijo: guarda con Venezuela, guarda con Venezuela. Y ahora su opinión está reivindicada porque hay un plan Venezuela en marcha por la decisión de Donald Trump. Así que, Luis, todo tuyo.
Gracias, Román. Gracias, presidentes, vicepresidente, amigas, amigos, colegas. Gracias al Instituto, gracias a Sánchez Berzaín, querido amigo, por esta invitación. Los ataques a la democracia. Los ataques a la democracia están concentrados en estos elementos: cooptación de poderes judiciales, opresión sobre los poderes judiciales, cooptación de los poderes electorales, opresión sobre los poderes electorales, como estamos viendo estos días. Libertad de expresión, fundamentalmente atacada en la peor manera que se recuerde en el continente. Esta es la región que mata más periodistas en el mundo, es la región que mata más activistas sociales, ambientales y de derechos humanos en el mundo. Y el ataque a los derechos humanos. Todos estos son elementos que se cruzan todo el tiempo entre dinámicas del Estado y el crimen organizado. El crimen organizado corta prácticamente cada uno de estos puntos. O sea, en la materia de violación de derechos humanos, hoy el sistema interamericano está completamente atrasado. Los principales violadores de derechos humanos, salvo en los casos de las 3 dictaduras, Cuba, Nicaragua y Venezuela, es el crimen organizado. Es el que está a cargo de las principales masacres en la región, secuestros y torturas. Son actividades permanentes del crimen organizado para fortalecer su dinámica de negocios. Definitivamente, sí, en cada uno de estos campos se cruza también algo que corta transversalmente los estados, y es la corrupción, que es lo que permite al crimen organizado permear y vincularse con dinámicas estatales y lograr resultados de administración pública o de ejecución de políticas. Ejecución de políticas que llevan obviamente a mejor posicionamiento del crimen organizado, como señalaron acá los que expusieron antes. O sea, cuando se eliminan controles, se hacen políticas de ablandamiento, cuando se hacen políticas de paz, es paz para los narcotraficantes, no es paz para la ciudadanía, no es paz para el ciudadano común o la ciudadana común. Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela son estados que viven en una permanente dinámica de apoyo y gestión del crimen organizado, lo cual uno en estos tiempos encuentra las paradojas todas expuestas. Por ejemplo, resulta que si el crimen organizado actúa en conjunto, eso es solidaridad latinoamericana, pero si se ataca el crimen organizado, entonces es intervencionismo. Si el crimen organizado es el que defiende la soberanía, parece. Y el ataque al crimen organizado es un ataque a la soberanía. Se van dando paradojas una atrás de la otra. No tenemos que olvidarnos que Cuba fue el primer narcoestado en la región, que salió del hoyo ejecutando a héroes de la revolución para calmar las cosas con Estados Unidos, porque definitivamente le habían dicho, por este lado, no, esto es lo que no vamos a tolerar nunca. Y eso definitivamente llevó a que es muy difícil que un gramo de cocaína pase por la isla, pero sí todos los asociados de los gobernantes de la isla están vinculados al crimen organizado, sean ELN, sean las FARC, sean los disidentes de las FARC, sea el narcoestado de Venezuela. O sea, todos los asociados están vinculados al crimen organizado, pero ellos no pasan ningún gramo por la isla como contención para mantenerse limpios. El tema de Venezuela nos ha llevado también a otras paradojas. O sea, prácticamente había que asegurar libre navegación y libre sobrevuelo al narcotráfico, porque, o sea, prácticamente el ataque a cualquier embarcación que llevara drogas es como un ataque, es un crimen de lesa humanidad, lo cual es algo absurdo. O sea, aquí mismo, si el policía da 3 veces la voz de alto, yo más vale que me detenga. O sea, es bastante lógico. Si un criminal pretende darse a la fuga, bueno, como que tiene que atenerse a las consecuencias respecto a eso. Estamos en un proceso de reversión. Hay algo que ya funcionó contra el crimen organizado y que era algo crucial y fundamental. O sea, hubo un momento que se produce el éxodo venezolano. El éxodo venezolano espontáneo, huyendo de la dictadura, escapando de la dictadura, empieza a ir para todos los rincones del continente. Fueron a dar a Uruguay, fueron a dar a Argentina, fueron a dar a todos los países de las Américas, por todos lados. Pero esta gente dijo, pero nos estamos perdiendo este negocio. Y entonces lo concentraron. Y entonces todos los venezolanos que habían salido o estaban saliendo todavía, ahora no pueden ir a cualquier lado de las Américas. Todos van a ir por acá, por el Darién, hacia arriba, hacia la frontera sur con Estados Unidos, para generar 2 impactos políticos, en el Darién y en la frontera sur. Eso se cortó Se cortó en la frontera sur y se cortó en el Darién. O sea, ha habido una reversión de la acción del crimen organizado, tráfico de personas, trata de personas, que tuvo un impacto inmediato y que ya, digamos, ese negocio quedó prácticamente clausurado. Y ahora es el turno del narcotráfico, lo cual implica una acción que tiene que ser cada vez más coordinada, pero o sea, es neutralizando, digamos, y tomando los mejores ejemplos del Plan Colombia, que fue el plan que funcionó. O sea, que tiene un elemento fundamental, que es la, digamos, por decirlo de una manera, la tercerización de la justicia. O sea, cuando está todo permeado, la justicia, por todos lados, fiscales, por todos lados, entonces tienen que ser juzgados en otro lado. Y traer a todos los delincuentes a ser juzgados acá es lo que revirtió el proceso en Colombia y revirtió el proceso en Panamá también en su momento con la operación Justa Causa. Entonces, sí, obviamente que tenemos que seguir trabajando para fortalecer la democracia, pero para fortalecer la democracia es fundamental, en primer lugar, erradicar a las 3 dictaduras, porque son los santuarios de la droga en este continente, y del crimen organizado en todas sus manifestaciones. Y una vez accionado estos mecanismos, obviamente tenemos que tendremos mejores capacidades de tener instituciones más fuertes y menos permeables, menos corrompibles, y con un efecto sobre la sociedad que es inmediatamente beneficioso, porque en ese uno lo ve en el resultado del Plan Colombia. Se detienen las masacres, se detienen los ataques terroristas, se detienen los secuestros. O sea, tiene un efecto inmediato sobre y un beneficio para la gente. Fundamentalmente es eso. Obviamente que el tema da para más de 5 minutos, creo. Gracias.
Bueno, la verdad que el seminario fue, o el fórum, como le gusta decir a Carlos, fue un diseño de él, una idea, una forma de plantear un hecho que todos los días nos sorprenden, y puedo citar el caso de la Argentina. El primer candidato a diputado por el oficialismo en el principal distrito para los comicios del 26 de octubre, que se llamaba José Luis Esper, porque no es más candidato, está siendo investigado por sus presuntas vinculaciones con un narcotraficante. O sea, entonces, me parece que este hecho tan complejo para la actual etapa democrática de la Argentina termina de reivindicar el sentido que planteó Carlos para este fórum, que es el cruce entre la región y el crimen organizado y la democracia. Así que, Carlos, escuchamos tus palabras de cierre en el foro.
Agradezco a los expresidentes, al presidente Pastrana, al presidente Mahuad, al ex vicepresidente Santos, a nuestro querido amigo, secretario general de la Organización de Estados Americanos, a todo el primer panel de académicos y expertos que nos han dado una visión detallada de cada uno de los aspectos de lo que son sus experticias, y que ha permitido hacer de este foro un aporte entre la gente que sabe de lo que son los elementos del crimen organizado, la gente que estudia esos elementos y la gente que ejerce el poder contra ese sistema. Gracias de verdad, gracias a FIU, a Infobae, a la Universidad Austral, por habernos acompañado en este seminario, que es la segunda parte de uno que hicimos en Buenos Aires el 2 de julio pasado, sobre la misma temática, donde varios de los estadistas que están aquí presentes pudieron acompañar. El foro Crimen Organizado y Democracia en América Latina ofrece un conjunto de conclusiones que voy a resumir con algunos comentarios y aportes personales. Primero, el eje de confrontación en las Américas y en el mundo, o sea, por qué chocan los poderes fácticos, es hoy día el que se presenta entre el crimen y la democracia. Y ese es el eje de confrontación de este siglo, solo que ahora se ve con claridad. El año 1999 había una sola dictadura en las Américas, la de Cuba, que agonizaba en su periodo especial, y llegó Hugo Chávez y la recreó y la dictadura se expandió. Y se expandió con un eslogan de marca política, socialismo del siglo XXI, y llegó a controlar bajo su modelo a Venezuela, a Nicaragua, a Bolivia y al Ecuador, que pasó por ahí por más de 10 años y que está en proceso de retirada. Ese crimen organizado tomó el poder político, ese crimen organizado controla gobiernos, ese crimen organizado, y en esto yo quiero establecer una diferencia que no es semántica, tiene que ver con que si los gobiernos del socialismo del siglo XXI, los regímenes del socialismo del siglo XXI, usan el crimen organizado o son el crimen organizado. Hoy día, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia y Nicaragua son narcoestados, no de hoy día, de hace rato, porque un narcoestado se define como aquel país en el que los funcionarios de gobierno hacen uso de sus potestades gubernamentales para participar en alguna de las etapas del narcotráfico. Cultivo de coca, promoción del cultivo de coca. En Bolivia han hecho partido político con las federaciones de productores de coca y de cocaína, están en el poder. Gestión en lo que es el transporte y el tráfico. El hub más importante del narcotráfico es Venezuela. Nicaragua no se quita de ahí, agregando lavado de dinero. Y la dirección de esto es la dictadura de Cuba, que, para dato nomás, en los últimos 8 años le han interceptado 2 buques, uno con 10 toneladas y el otro con 25 toneladas de cocaína, embarcados desde el puerto de Mariel de Cuba. ¿Desde cuándo Cuba tiene producción de cocaína en la isla para poder exportar esas cantidades de droga? De repente eso explica el vuelo semanal de BOA, la empresa estatal boliviana, que vuela desde Bolivia a Cuba y no se sabe quién va ni qué cosa sucede. O sea, primer punto, el eje de confrontación en las Américas es entre el crimen y la democracia. El segundo punto, si me permites, Rodrigo, gracias. El segundo punto, el instrumento de ataque es algo que hoy día se conoce como guerra híbrida. La guerra híbrida es una expresión, es un concepto que refleja cualquier forma de agresión en contra de un país, de una democracia, con el propósito de debilitarla. Y los instrumentos de la guerra híbrida hoy día son el narcotráfico, la migración forzada, el terrorismo, la trata de personas, la desestabilización de gobiernos, el calentamiento de la calle, la participación política. Resulta que estas dictaduras del socialismo del siglo XXI van a los países con democracia, instalan proyectos políticos y ganan elecciones. Y de esa manera aparece el concepto de lo que se llama los gobiernos paradictatoriales, que son gobiernos en países democráticos, elegidos democráticamente, pero que le deben el haber llegado a la toma del poder, a la toma del gobierno, al socialismo del siglo XXI. Y esos gobiernos paradictatoriales hoy día son México, desde López Obrador, hoy día Sheinbaum, Colombia con Petro, Lula del Brasil, a quien han sacado de la cárcel para volverlo a ser presidente, además fundador del FORO de Sao Paulo, Castro en Honduras, y Boric, que tiene una posición en la que se distancia de su situación paradictatorial en el caso de Venezuela, pero que de Cuba no dice nada y acompaña al socialismo del siglo XXI en todo lo demás, incluido su antisemitismo. Tercer elemento, se produce este año, el 2025 será recordado por la historia como el año del cambio geopolítico en las Américas y en el mundo. Y ese cambio geopolítico que lo estamos viviendo, que se está produciendo a partir del reconocimiento del eje de confrontación, de la identificación del enemigo, etcétera, se produce porque Estados Unidos ha cambiado su política exterior. Y ha cambiado su política exterior en base a su política interna que prioriza la seguridad nacional. Y a partir de la priorización de su seguridad nacional opera el cambio de identificar al enemigo como el narcoterrorismo y le declara la guerra. Hemos pasado del paradigma de la guerra contra el terrorismo que vino después de los ataques del 11 de septiembre del 2001 y después de un sistema de contención con una política exterior deforme y confusa y de abandono de los aliados, sobre todo en Latinoamérica por parte de Estados Unidos, hemos pasado hoy día a la política de la guerra contra el narcoterrorismo. Ahí vamos. Pero eso es un cambio geopolítico sustancial que estamos viviendo. Finalmente, frente a estos hechos, ¿qué hacen o qué deben hacer o qué van a hacer las democracias de América Latina? Aquí hemos escuchado la sugerencia del presidente Pastrana, que dice que hay que hacer un plan para el Ecuador, ya está en ejecución un plan Venezuela, como lo ha dicho Luis Almagro, pero en el proceso de lo que es este primer frente de batalla contra la delincuencia organizada transnacional, que es el del narcoterrorismo, hace falta un plan integral de las democracias de América Latina, que tienen que empezar por no coexistir con los dueños del crimen organizado, que son las dictaduras de Cuba, de Venezuela, de Bolivia y de Nicaragua, cuyos gobernantes, entre comillas, aprovechan inmunidades, privilegios, usan embajadas para proteger a la delincuencia organizada, para narcotraficar y para desestabilizar los gobiernos. O sea, hace falta salir de ese concepto tan dañino para la democracia, que es lo políticamente correcto, y aterrizar en el hecho de la necesidad estratégica de identificar al enemigo. Y en este caso el enemigo tiene cara o carátula de política, se llama socialismo del siglo XXI, yo lo llamo castrochavismo también, y reúne la conjunción no de que están influidos por el crimen organizado, son el crimen organizado, y esa es una conclusión personal mía. Muchas gracias. Quiero invitar, por favor, a los ejecutivos de la Florida International University, que nos han acogido tan afectuosamente, a don Carlos Becerra y al profesor Gamarra, para que nos den una breve explicación sobre su proyecto en Washington y sobre este gran...
Bueno, me toca presentarles, bueno, primero darles nuevamente nuestro enorme agradecimiento por haber acogido, bueno, venir acá y sobre todo con personalidades tan importantes para nosotros. Es verdaderamente un placer haberlos recibido acá. Quiero presentarles a al director de este centro, Carlos Becerra, que tiene una trayectoria larguísima en FIU desde que era undergraduate nuestro, ¿no? Carlos, can you give us a little bit of a show and tell on what we are? Great.
Me prometió que iba a hablar inglés, pero yo sí. Well, welcome. Glad to see you all here. Many familiar faces and new faces. Welcome to FIU in Washington, D.C. It's been a pleasure to host everyone here. I see Mr. Secretary General. Always great to see you. First off, the message number one is our doors are always open for our friends. We take seriously these national partnerships, international partnerships that we forged over the decades because of faculty like Eduardo and many others on campus, such as our Green School of International Public Affairs, our Adam Smith Center, so many that are active on many of these important issues. And I know even this December, we will have a full FIU team effort at the Summit of the Americas this year. So that's exciting. But here in Washington, D.C., FIU, which of course is Miami's public research university, 55,000 students, now decades of strength and capacity in Latin America and the Caribbean, a lot of environmental resilience, population health, defense technologies is a big growth area for us. Here in Washington, we take our responsibility seriously to celebrate our federal partnerships with many key agencies, in this case, many with the State Department and the former USAID, and the Defense Department, et cetera, Department of War. But additionally, we're here to support our students. On any given year, we host about 600 to 700 students for short-term seminars. Next Monday, we will kick off 3 days of a very innovative program on the future of space innovation, and technology and policy. These are designed to bring our amazing students, and some of them you'll see are already here at the center, get them connected to many of the important organizations like your own as well, and get them jobs and internships. So that's our second. And our third vertical is very important to us, and we're proving it here today. We take seriously the role of convening many partners, and we're pleased to do that with you all today. But I want to thank Eduardo also for always maintaining a lot of these enlaces and these partnerships strong. So to end the program here, we encourage you to interact with our wall, which touches on many of our key research themes. Check out our research cubbies, of course. Cafecito is still available, so feel free to take advantage of that. And we wanted to show you a quick little video that covers, in a minute or so, a lot of the key national priorities that FIU is leading on. Oh, and if the students in the room can wave. I'd like to point out that several of these are interning on Capitol Hill. In this case, the office of Congressman Donalds. And they may be interning today, but on the other side of the aisle, another great individual, Ignacio Olmos, is Bolivian, of course, is the proof positive of why we're doing what we do up here. Ignacio is a proud staff member to Florida Senator Ashley Moody, and has been working on the Hill prior to that. So this is the bridge we also see, because it's these future professionals and these current professionals that are really helping advance a lot of your issues today. So let me wrap it up with the final video, and thank you so much.